In the 1920s, long before the term serial killer even existed, a quiet traveler carrying a small suitcase moved silently between American and Canadian cities, politely knocking on boarding house doors and asking for a room for the night. Yet behind that calm voice and ordinary appearance was Earle Leonard Nelson, later known as the Guerrilla Killer, a mysterious drifter whose disturbing crimes triggered one of the first international manhunts in North American history, leaving investigators across two countries asking the same haunting question: how did a man who seemed so harmless become one of the most elusive and chilling killers of the early 20th century? Chapter 1: The man they called the Guerrilla Killer. In the quiet decades of the early 20th century, long before the term serial killer entered the public vocabulary, a shadow moved silently through boarding houses, small apartments, and rented rooms across North America. The man responsible appeared ordinary enough at first glance: polite, soft-spoken, and often carrying a suitcase that suggested he was simply another traveler passing through unfamiliar towns. But behind that calm exterior existed a mind driven by impulses few people could comprehend. His name was Earle Leonard Nelson. History would remember him by a far darker nickname: the Guerrilla Killer. The name did not emerge from exaggeration or rumor. It came from the frightening physical strength he possessed and the methodical way he overpowered his victims. Witnesses and investigators alike were struck by the same unsettling observation. Nelson moved with a strange, almost animal-like intensity when he attacked, using sudden bursts of force that left his victims with little chance to defend themselves. Yet in everyday interactions, nothing about him seemed extraordinary. That he was polite, quiet, sometimes even charming. And that contradiction is what made him so dangerous. During the mid-1920s, newspapers across the United States and Canada began reporting a string of mysterious deaths. The victims were often women who rented rooms in boarding houses or operated small lodging businesses from their homes. Many of these women lived alone, managing modest properties where travelers could rent inexpensive rooms for short stays. In an era before modern surveillance, background checks, or centralized police databases, boarding houses were common across cities and towns. Travelers, laborers, and drifters frequently moved from place to place, renting temporary lodging for a few nights or weeks before continuing their journeys. It was a system built on trust, and Earle Leonard Nelson exploited that trust perfectly. He would arrive in a town appearing like any other traveler. Sometimes he introduced himself using his real name. Other times he used false identities. He would knock on the doors of boarding houses, politely asking if a room was available. Often, the woman who answered the door would see a slightly awkward but harmless young man carrying luggage. Within hours, she would disappear. First, authorities struggled to connect the incidents. Each case appeared isolated. Each town believed it was dealing with a local crime, perhaps a robbery that had gone wrong or a tragic accident within the home. Police departments in different cities rarely communicated with one another in the way modern investigators do today. As a result, the true scale of the danger remained hidden. While communities mourned individual victims, few realized that the same man might be responsible for deaths hundreds of miles apart. The mystery deepened because Nelson did not fit the image people expected when they imagined a violent criminal. He was not particularly large or imposing in appearance. In fact, some described him as somewhat small and slightly hunched in posture. His eyes, however, were often noted as intense and unusually focused. Those who met him sometimes felt a subtle unease they could not fully explain. It was only later, after investigators began piecing together his movements, that the horrifying pattern became clear. The crimes followed a chilling routine. Nelson would search neighborhoods for boarding houses run by women living alone. Once he located a suitable place, he would knock on the door and ask about renting a room. If invited inside, he would carefully observe the layout of the home and assess whether anyone else might be present. Moments later, the attack would occur suddenly and violently. Afterward, Nelson often fled the area quickly, boarding trains or buses to reach another city before authorities could begin searching for him, in a time before coordinated law enforcement systems. This mobility allowed him to stay one step ahead of investigators. But there was another aspect of his behavior that puzzled authorities. Unlike criminals motivated purely by financial gain, Nelson sometimes took very little from the homes of his victims. Occasionally small items disappeared, but robbery did not appear to be the primary motive. Instead, the crime suggested something far more disturbing, a deeply disturbed psychological pattern that investigators of the era struggled to understand. Today, criminal psychologists studying historical cases often point to Nelson as one of the earliest documented examples of a traveling serial killer operating across international borders. But to understand how such a person emerged, it is necessary to look much earlier in his life, because long before the murders began, long before newspapers printed the terrifying nickname, the Gorilla Killer, there was simply a boy growing up in California, a boy whose early life contained signs of instability, trauma, and isolation that many historians now believe played a crucial role in shaping the man he would become. Neighbors would later remember strange incidents from his youth. Teachers recalled unusual behavior. Family members struggled to understand the dramatic changes that seemed to occur as he grew older. The center of those changes was an event that some experts believe permanently altered the course of his life, an injury at a moment of violence, and a childhood environment that failed to recognize the warning signs. Those early years would quietly lay the foundation for one of the most disturbing criminal journeys of the 1920s, the journey that would eventually spread across two countries, trigger an international manhunt, and leave investigators asking a haunting question. How could someone who appeared so ordinary carry such darkness within them? The answer begins far from the crime scenes that later made headlines. It begins in the early life of Earle Leonard Nelson, and the strange, troubling childhood that may have shaped everything that followed. In the early decades of the 20th century, North America was a place in motion. Railroads stretched across the continent like steel veins, carrying passengers from crowded cities to distant towns and back again. Boarding houses dotted the landscape of nearly every growing community, offering temporary shelter for travelers, laborers, and drifters who moved from place to place in search of opportunity. These homes were often run by women who managed the property themselves. A spare bedroom could easily be converted into a rented space, and a steady flow of guests helped provide income in an era when financial independence for women was often difficult to achieve. The arrangement seemed simple and safe. That a traveler knocked on the door, that a room was offered, payment was exchanged, and the guests stayed quietly for a night or two before continuing on their journey. It was a routine repeated thousands of times across the United States and Canada every single day. Yet sometime in the mid-1920s, something unusual began happening inside some of these homes. A guest would arrive, the guest would leave, and shortly afterward, the woman who owned the boarding house would be discovered missing or deceased under mysterious circumstances. First, these tragedies appeared isolated. Local authorities treated each case as an individual investigation, focusing on immediate surroundings rather than searching for connections across distant cities. Communication between police departments in that era was slow and fragmented. Without modern databases or coordinated investigative networks, It was extremely difficult to track suspects moving between jurisdictions for someone determined to disappear after committing a crime. The world of the 1920s offered many opportunities, and that was precisely the environment in which Earle Leonard Nelson operated. AS investigators later reconstructed his movements. A chilling pattern began to emerge. Nelson rarely stayed in one place for long. He traveled frequently, often using trains that connected major cities with smaller communities along the railway routes. These journeys allowed him to appear in one location briefly before vanishing again, leaving investigators with little time to react. Witness descriptions of him were remarkably consistent. He appeared quiet and slightly awkward. He spoke politely, sometimes with a reserved tone that gave the impression of a shy traveler. His clothing was usually neat but modest, blending easily with the appearance of countless other men traveling for work during that period. There was nothing about him that immediately suggested danger. This was perhaps the most unsettling detail. When neighbors or acquaintances later described their brief interactions with Nelson, many expressed the same disbelief. He had seemed normal, quiet, perhaps even timid. Some remembered him as respectful and soft-spoken. Yet behind that calm demeanor was a mind investigators would later describe as deeply disturbed. The nickname, the Gorilla Killer, began appearing in newspapers during the height of the investigation. Reporters used the phrase to describe the sudden, overwhelming strength Nelson seemed to display during his attacks. Witnesses who had seen him in moments of confrontation described something unusual. His movements changed. The quiet traveler who knocked politely on doors could suddenly transform into someone driven by intense bursts of energy. His posture shifted, his grip became extremely powerful, and the violence appeared abrupt and shocking. These accounts fascinated and disturbed readers across North America. Newspapers in the 1920s often competed fiercely for attention, and sensational headlines were common. Yet even among dramatic reporting styles, the story of the traveling killer stood out. Articles described a mysterious man moving silently between cities, that a stranger arriving with a suitcase, that a quiet guest whose visit ended in tragedy. AS reports multiplied. Investigators slowly began connecting incidents that had previously been treated as unrelated crimes. One of the most significant challenges in the investigation was the lack of modern forensic science. Techniques such as fingerprint databases were still developing, and communication between police departments often relied on telegrams or written reports sent through the mail. This meant that identifying patterns across long distances required extraordinary effort. Detectives began examining train routes. They compared witness descriptions. They studied the timelines of incidents in different cities. Gradually, the evidence pointed toward a single individual moving across the continent, and that individual appeared to be responsible for a growing number of tragedies. The realization sparked growing concern among authorities in both the United States and Canada. If the same man was responsible for multiple crimes in different regions, it meant investigators were dealing with something relatively new in criminal history: a traveling murderer who crossed state and national boundaries. Today, the concept of a serial killer is widely understood. But during the 1920s, law enforcement had not yet developed the vocabulary or investigative frameworks that modern criminology uses to analyze such cases. Instead, detectives relied on instinct, observation, and persistence. As the investigation continued, a portrait of Nelson began to form. He appeared to be methodical in his movements. His crimes often occurred shortly after arriving in a new city. He typically targeted women who operated boarding houses or rented rooms from their homes. This pattern suggested careful observation and planning. Nelson seemed to understand the routines of these households. He knew when women might be alone. He knew how to present himself as an ordinary traveler seeking accommodation. and once inside, he acted quickly. Authorities soon realized that capturing him would not be easy. Each time a new lead emerged, Nelson was already gone, traveling hundreds of miles away to another town where no one recognized him. Newspaper readers followed the unfolding investigation with growing fascination. The story combined mystery, danger, and a sense of urgency that captured public attention across the continent. Who was this man? Where had he come from? And how had he become capable of such disturbing acts? Those questions slowly led investigators backward through Nelson's life. Before the crimes, before the newspaper headlines, before the nickname that would define his place in criminal history. They traced his origins to California, where his childhood had been shaped by unusual circumstances and troubling experiences that many experts later believe played a crucial role in shaping his psychological development. Family history revealed episodes of instability. Teachers remembered a boy who sometimes behaved unpredictably. And one particular event from his youth stood out above all others, an incident involving a serious injury. Point one, that some modern researchers believe may have altered his personality in ways that were not fully understood at the time. That to truly understand the man who became known as the gorilla killer, investigators realized they had to examine those early years carefully, because somewhere in that childhood, in moments that might have seemed small or insignificant at the time, lay the first clues to the darkness that would later emerge. The quiet boy growing up in California would eventually become one of the most feared traveling criminals of his era. But at the beginning, he was simply a child whose life was about to take a path no one around him could have predicted, and the story of how that transformation began is where the next chapter truly starts. Chapter 2: A childhood marked by trauma and darkness. Long before the newspapers across North America began printing the terrifying nickname, the Gorilla Killer, long before investigators attempted to track his movements across cities and borders, the life of Earle Leonard Nelson began in circumstances that, at first glance, seemed entirely ordinary. He was born on May 12, 1897, in San Francisco, California, a city that at the turn of the 20th century was growing rapidly with opportunity and industry. The bustling streets were filled with immigrants, merchants, dock workers, and families attempting to build stable lives in a region that promised prosperity. But Nelson's earliest years were far from stable. His father, a man whose presence in the household was brief and troubled, died when Earle was still very young. The loss left the family in a difficult position, and the responsibility of raising the child fell almost entirely on his mother and grandmother. That it was his grandmother who would play the most significant role in shaping the boy's early environment. She was deeply religious and intensely strict, holding beliefs that reflected a rigid and unforgiving interpretation of morality. According to historical accounts, her worldview was dominated by the idea that sin was everywhere and that punishment from a higher power was inevitable for those who strayed from righteousness. That in such a household, young Earle grew up surrounded by constant warnings about moral corruption and eternal consequences. For a child still trying to understand the world, these messages could be overwhelming. Neighbors and acquaintances later recalled that the home environment felt unusually tense. Discipline was harsh, and discussions about morality were often framed in frightening, absolute terms. The boy was frequently reminded of the dangers of temptation and the severe consequences awaiting those who behaved improperly. Some historians believe that this atmosphere may have contributed to a deep internal conflict within Nelson as he grew older. That on one hand, he was raised with rigid moral expectations that left little room for mistakes or curiosity. On the other hand, like any child, he possessed natural impulses and questions about the world around him. This contradiction created a psychological pressure that may have begun shaping his personality in subtle ways. School records from Nelson's childhood suggest that he was not considered an exceptional student. Teachers described him as quiet and somewhat withdrawn. He did not stand out academically, nor was he particularly social with other children. Yet there were moments when his behavior seemed unusual. Some classmates later remembered that Nelson occasionally displayed sudden mood changes. At times he appeared calm and passive, while at other moments he seemed agitated or distant, as though preoccupied with thoughts he did not share with others. These observations might have seemed insignificant at the time. Children often go through phases of emotional fluctuation, and in the early 1900s there was little understanding of psychological development or mental health. Behavior that might raise concerns today often went unnoticed or was dismissed as ordinary childhood temperament. But as Nelson grew older, certain patterns became harder to ignore that he struggled to form lasting friendships. He spent long periods alone, and those who knew him occasionally sensed a kind of emotional distance that made him difficult to understand. His grandmother's influence remained strong throughout these formative years. Her strict beliefs shaped not only the rules of the household, but also the way Nelson viewed himself and the world. He was taught that moral weakness could lead to terrible consequences. He was warned constantly about the dangers of impure thoughts or improper behavior. This intense focus on moral control sometimes created an atmosphere of fear rather than guidance. Modern psychologists studying historical cases often point to such environments as potential contributors to emotional repression. When children are raised in settings where curiosity or self-expression is discouraged, they may struggle to develop healthy ways of processing emotions that in Nelson's case. These struggles may have been compounded by the absence of a stable father figure and the strict authority of his grandmother. Yet despite these challenges, there was little in his early childhood that clearly predicted the crimes that would occur years later. He did not grow up in extreme poverty. He did not have a long history of violent incidents during childhood to those outside the family. He likely appeared to be simply another quiet boy growing up in a crowded American city, but something within him seemed increasingly unsettled as he approached adolescence. And then, an event occurred that many researchers believe may have changed the trajectory of his life in profound ways. When Nelson was still a young teenager, he was involved in an accident that resulted in a severe head injury. The exact details vary in different historical accounts, but most agree that the injury was significant enough to leave him unconscious for an extended period of time. In the early 1900s, medical understanding of brain injuries was extremely limited. Doctors could treat physical wounds, but the long-term neurological effects of trauma were poorly understood. After Nelson recovered from the injury, those close to him began noticing subtle changes. Some family members believed his personality had shifted. He appeared more withdrawn, more unpredictable. At times, he seemed disconnected from the people around him. While it is impossible to determine exactly how much this injury affected Nelson's mental state, modern researchers often consider head trauma as a possible factor when examining the origins of certain violent behaviors. Brain injuries can sometimes alter emotional regulation, impulse control, and decision-making processes that if such changes occurred in Nelson, they may have combined with the pressures of his upbringing to create a complex and unstable psychological foundation. But the transformation was gradual. Years passed before the darker aspects of his personality became visible to the outside world. During this time, Nelson entered adolescence, a stage of life already filled with emotional turbulence for many individuals. For him, however, the internal conflict seemed to grow more intense. Family members began noticing strange habits. His behavior sometimes appeared erratic, And certain incidents from these teenage years would later cause investigators to look back with renewed concern, because in hindsight, they seemed less like harmless oddities and more like early warning signs, signs that the quiet boy growing up, under strict supervision, might be developing a mind that struggled to control its darker impulses. Those early signs would only become clearer as Nelson moved closer to adulthood. And the next chapter of his life would reveal a turning point that many experts now consider critical in understanding the path he eventually followed, at a moment when the internal conflicts of his childhood began to manifest in ways that were impossible to ignore. As the teenage years of Earle Leonard Nelson unfolded, the subtle changes that followed his head injury slowly became more noticeable to those around him. What had once been dismissed as ordinary moodiness or the quiet nature of a shy boy began to take on a different tone. Family members described moments when Nelson appeared disconnected from reality, as if drifting into long stretches of silence where he seemed absorbed in his own thoughts. At other times, his behavior shifted suddenly. He might become agitated or restless without any obvious cause that in the early 20th century. Such behavior was rarely interpreted through the lens of psychology or neurology. Mental health was a poorly understood subject, and many families simply tried to manage unusual behavior privately rather than seeking medical help. For Nelson's relatives, particularly his grandmother who had been so strict throughout his childhood, discipline remained the primary solution. If the boy behaved strangely, the assumption was that stronger moral guidance and stricter rules might correct the problem. But the internal struggles Nelson faced were not easily corrected by discipline. As he moved further into adolescence, the tension between his upbringing and his internal impulses appeared to grow stronger. He had spent years hearing warnings about sin and moral weakness, yet he seemed increasingly unable to control thoughts and behaviors that conflicted with those teachings. Some accounts from acquaintances during this period describe him as deeply conflicted about his own emotions. He sometimes expressed intense guilt over thoughts he considered immoral. At other times, he seemed withdrawn, almost as if he were trying to suppress parts of his own personality. For a young man raised in a household where moral purity was emphasized constantly, these internal struggles may have felt overwhelming. Yet another important factor began to influence Nelson's life during these years: isolation. That he did not appear to form strong friendships. He rarely participated in the kinds of social activities that helped other teenagers develop emotional stability and interpersonal skills. Instead, he often spent time alone. This isolation likely deepened the sense that he existed somewhat apart from the people around him. While most young men his age were beginning to imagine careers, relationships, and future plans, Nelson seemed to drift without a clear direction. His education did not lead to any particular professional path, and he struggled to find stable employment. But it was not only uncertainty about his future that concerned those who knew him. There were also moments when his behavior suggested deeper instability. One incident that later drew attention involved reports that Nelson had begun showing signs of obsessive behavior related to religious guilt and personal morality. According to some historical accounts, he sometimes attempted to confess imagined sins repeatedly, as if trying to relieve an internal pressure he could not explain. This pattern suggested a mind struggling to reconcile intense emotions with the rigid moral framework imposed during childhood. In many ways, Nelson appeared trapped between two conflicting forces. On one side was the strict religious environment that had defined his upbringing, teaching him that moral weakness must be suppressed at all costs. On the other side were impulses and thoughts he seemed unable to control or fully understand. The psychological strain created by this conflict may have contributed to increasingly erratic behavior. Eventually, his family reached a point where they felt unable to manage his condition alone at some stage during his youth, Nelson was reportedly admitted to a mental institution for evaluation. Institutions during this era were vastly different from modern psychiatric facilities. Treatments were limited, and the understanding of mental health disorders was extremely primitive compared to today. Patients were often placed in these institutions simply to remove them from stressful environments or to monitor unusual behavior. Records from such institutions were not always detailed, and in many cases, the precise nature of a patient's condition remained unclear even to doctors. What is known is that Nelson spent a period of time under supervision, and eventually he was released. Back into society at the time. There was no clear indication that he would become a violent offender. Instead, he appeared to be simply a troubled young man struggling to find stability. After leaving the institution, Nelson attempted to return to ordinary life. Like many young men of the early 1900s, he searched for work and attempted to establish some form of independence. But stability remained elusive. He moved between jobs, rarely staying in one place for long. Employers sometimes described him as quiet but unreliable, someone who seemed distracted or distant during work. These difficulties made it harder for him to build a stable life. Financial uncertainty, combined with lingering psychological struggles, likely deepened his sense of isolation. Yet during these years, something else was quietly developing, a pattern of travel. Nelson began moving from city to city, sometimes for employment opportunities, sometimes seemingly without clear purpose. Railroads made such travel relatively easy, and thousands of young men moved across the country in search of work during this era. Observers. Nelson's movement might have appeared ordinary, but in hindsight, investigators would later realize that this pattern of mobility would play a critical role in the crimes that eventually followed. Travel allowed anonymity that in each new city. He could appear as a stranger starting fresh. N01 knew his past. N01 recognized the internal struggles that had shaped his early life. This ability to move unnoticed would later become one of the most significant factors in how long he was able to evade authorities. But during the years immediately following his youth, Nelson had not yet entered the period that would bring his name into newspaper headlines. At this stage, he was still simply drifting through life, a quiet, troubled man moving from place to place while searching for stability he seemed unable to achieve. Yet beneath that wandering existence, something darker appeared to be forming. Historians and criminal psychologists studying the case today often emphasize that violent offenders rarely emerge suddenly without warning. Instead, their development is usually shaped by a complex combination of personal experiences, psychological pressures, and environmental influences. In Nelson's case, those influences had been building quietly for years. A strict and fearful upbringing, a traumatic head injury, isolation during adolescence, periods of psychological instability, and a growing pattern of movement between cities that allowed him to remain largely anonymous. Individually, each factor might not have seemed alarming, but together, they formed a foundation that would eventually support a far more disturbing transformation. By the time Nelson reached adulthood, the quiet boy raised under strict supervision had become a restless man moving across the country without clear direction. And somewhere within that restless movement, the impulses that had troubled him since youth would begin to surface in ways that no one around him could ignore. The next chapter of his life would reveal the first unmistakable signs that the darkness within him was no longer contained, and those early warning signs would mark the beginning of a path that would soon shock communities across two nations. Chapter 3: The Head Injury That Changed Everything. When historians and criminal psychologists attempt to understand the life of Earle Leonard Nelson, one moment repeatedly emerges as a possible turning point. It is an event that occurred long before the crimes, long before the traveling across states and borders, and long before the newspapers began using the name that would follow him through history. It was a head injury. In the early years of the 20th century, medical knowledge about brain trauma was extremely limited. Doctors understood broken bones and visible wounds, but the invisible effects of injuries to the brain were largely misunderstood. Changes in behavior after such injuries were often attributed to personality or moral weakness rather than neurological damage. For Nelson, the injury happened during his youth, while he was still living under the strict supervision of his grandmother in California. Accounts vary slightly depending on the historical source, but most descriptions agree that the accident was severe. During an incident involving a moving streetcar, Nelson either fell or was thrown from the vehicle and struck his head with considerable force. Witnesses reported that he lost consciousness. For a period of time, the young boy remained unresponsive. In modern medicine, such an event would immediately raise concerns about traumatic brain injury. Doctors today understand that damage to certain areas of the brain can alter emotional regulation, impulse control, and even personality. But in the early 1900s, physicians had few tools to measure these changes. Once Nelson regained consciousness and appeared physically stable, the assumption was that he had recovered. Yet according to people who knew him, something about his behavior began to change after the incident. The shift was not dramatic at first. It unfolded gradually, in ways that might easily be dismissed if someone was not paying close attention. Family members later described subtle differences in his mood and demeanor. The quiet boy they knew seemed to become even more withdrawn. His emotional responses sometimes appeared delayed or disconnected from the situations around him, but at other times, he displayed unusual bursts of agitation. These moments were confusing for those who observed them. One day he might appear calm and reserved, speaking very little and keeping to himself. The next day he might seem restless, pacing or behaving in ways that suggested internal discomfort he could not explain. Modern neurological research suggests that injuries to certain parts of the brain can affect the frontal lobe, the region responsible for decision-making, impulse control, and social behavior. When the frontal lobe is damaged, individuals may struggle with emotional regulation. They may have difficulty understanding consequences or controlling sudden impulses. While it is impossible to diagnose historical figures with certainty, many experts studying Nelson's case believe the head injury may have contributed to later behavioral instability. But the injury did not occur in isolation. It happened within a childhood already shaped by strict discipline, religious pressure, and emotional isolation. This combination may have intensified the psychological impact of the accident. For example, if Nelson began experiencing strange thoughts or emotional shifts after the injury, the rigid moral environment of his home may have caused him to interpret those changes as signs of personal failure or moral weakness. Instead of seeking understanding or support, he may have attempted to suppress these feelings, and suppression rarely resolves internal conflict. Over time, unresolved psychological tension can build in ways that become increasingly difficult to manage. Some historical accounts suggest that Nelson experienced episodes of confusion or unusual thinking after the injury. He sometimes struggled to maintain focus, and people around him occasionally noticed moments when he seemed mentally distant. These symptoms could easily be interpreted as daydreaming or distraction, but in hindsight, investigators and historians see them as possible early indicators of deeper neurological changes. Another important detail from this period involves Nelson's relationship with authority and control. As a child, he had grown up in a household where obedience was expected and discipline was strict. After the injury, however, There were moments when he appeared to resist that control in subtle ways. He might ignore instructions. He might withdraw completely from conversation. At times, he seemed emotionally detached from the authority figures who attempted to guide his behavior. For a grandmother who believed strongly in discipline and moral correction, this change must have been troubling. Yet, without modern medical knowledge, there were few ways to interpret the situation accurately. Instead, Nelson's behavior was often treated as a character issue rather than a medical concern. This misunderstanding may have contributed to a cycle of frustration within the household. If Nelson struggled internally due to neurological changes, and those struggles were met primarily with stricter discipline, the emotional tension between him and his caregivers likely intensified. The young boy who had once been quiet but manageable was slowly becoming more unpredictable. But the most significant aspect of the injury may not have been immediately visible. Some researchers believe that Nelson's emotional responses gradually became less empathetic over time. Empathy, the ability to understand and share the feelings of others, is closely connected to certain brain functions. When those functions are disrupted, individuals may struggle to interpret the emotions of people around them. That if such changes occurred in Nelson, they might have contributed to the emotional detachment that investigators later observed in his adult behavior. However, during his youth, these shifts remained subtle, and no one around him could have predicted the crimes that would occur years later. To neighbors and acquaintances, Nelson likely still appeared to be simply an unusual but quiet young man, growing up under strict supervision. The deeper consequences of the injury would take years to fully emerge, and by the time those consequences became visible, Nelson would already be entering adulthood, a period when the internal conflicts of his childhood would collide with the pressures of the outside world. What began as a single accident involving a streetcar may have altered the course of his life in ways no one at the time could fully understand. But the injury alone did not create the man, who would later terrify communities across North America. Instead, it became one piece of a much larger puzzle, a puzzle that included psychological isolation, social instability, and a growing pattern of behavior that would soon become impossible to ignore. As Nelson moved into adulthood, the subtle changes that began after the accident would combine with other influences in ways that shaped the path he eventually followed. And that path would lead toward actions that shocked investigators and historians alike. The quiet boy who once recovered from a childhood accident was slowly becoming something far more complicated and far more dangerous than anyone around him could have imagined. As the years passed following the accident, the life of Earle Leonard Nelson moved quietly into early adulthood. On the surface, nothing about his life seemed especially remarkable. Like many young men during the early decades of the 20th century, he searched for work, attempted to establish independence, and tried to find his place in a rapidly changing society. Yet beneath that ordinary appearance, the psychological changes that began after his head injury appeared to deepen. People who encountered Nelson during these years often described a man who seemed slightly disconnected from the world around him. Conversations with him could feel unusual. He sometimes responded slowly to questions or appeared to pause for long moments before speaking, as if carefully processing thoughts that others expressed more naturally. There were also moments when he appeared intensely focused, staring at people or objects with an unsettling level of concentration. For acquaintances who only met him briefly, these characteristics might have seemed like simple personality traits. Some people are naturally quiet or introspective. Others appear socially awkward without causing any concern. But when these traits were combined with the emotional volatility that occasionally surfaced, the picture became more complex. Accounts from individuals who worked with Nelson during short periods of employment suggested that his mood could shift suddenly. He might spend long stretches of time calm and reserved, performing tasks quietly without drawing attention. Then, without clear reason, he could become restless or irritable. Employers sometimes found it difficult to understand him. He rarely spoke about his personal life. He kept conversations short and avoided discussing emotions or opinions. This pattern reinforced the sense that Nelson lived largely inside his own thoughts. By the time he entered his early 20s, his life had begun to develop another defining feature: constant movement. Rather than settling in one place for long periods, Nelson moved frequently from city to city. Jobs were temporary, and living arrangements were rarely stable. He might rent a room for a short time before leaving suddenly, sometimes without much explanation. During the early 20th century, such movement was not entirely unusual. The American economy relied heavily on seasonal labor, and many young men traveled across the country looking for opportunities in factories, railroads, or construction. But in Nelson's case, the movement appeared less connected to employment and more connected to an underlying restlessness. He seemed unable to remain in one place. Historians studying his life often describe this period as a stage when his internal instability began to shape his outward behavior rather than building stable relationships or long-term plans. Nelson drifted. Each new city offered anonymity. Each new job allowed him to present himself as someone without a complicated past. But anonymity can also create a sense of detachment. When individuals move constantly, they rarely form strong connections with others. Without those connections, the social boundaries that guide behavior can become weaker. For Nelson, this isolation may have allowed troubling thoughts and impulses to grow without challenge. Another important factor during this time was his increasing exposure to urban environments. Cities in the early 20th century were crowded and constantly changing. Boarding houses were common, especially in neighborhoods near rail stations or industrial areas. Travelers and workers frequently rented rooms for short periods before moving on. These boarding houses would later play a critical role in Nelson's crimes. But during this earlier stage of his life, they simply served as temporary shelters during his travels. It is possible that his familiarity with these environments, the layout of the houses, the routines of the owners, and the absence of close community supervision, quietly shaped his understanding of how such places functioned. Years later, that knowledge would become disturbingly significant. During his early adulthood, however, Nelson had not yet attracted serious attention from law enforcement. He remained largely invisible, that a quiet traveler moving through cities, the temporary employee working short jobs, that a man who left little impression on the people he met. Yet within this ordinary appearance, investigators later discovered signs that his psychological condition continued to deteriorate. There were reports that Nelson sometimes experienced intense episodes of religious anxiety. The strict moral teachings of his childhood remained deeply embedded in his thinking, and he occasionally expressed fear that he had committed spiritual wrongdoing even when there was no clear reason for such concern. This pattern of guilt and internal conflict may have created powerful emotional pressure. Modern psychologists sometimes describe such conditions as a form of obsessive moral anxiety, where individuals feel compelled to judge their own thoughts and actions harshly. In Nelson's case, the combination of strict religious upbringing, neurological trauma, and emotional isolation may have intensified this struggle. But as the years passed, another shift seemed to occur. The guilt and anxiety that once dominated his thinking gradually began to coexist with something darker. Instead of simply fearing wrongdoing, Nelson sometimes appeared fascinated by thoughts he had once tried to suppress. This transformation was not immediately visible to those around him. Outwardly, he still appeared quiet and somewhat timid. But internally, investigators believe his mind was changing in ways that would eventually become impossible to ignore. The first clear signs of serious trouble appeared when Nelson began experiencing encounters with law enforcement. These early incidents did not involve the crimes that later made him infamous, but they revealed behavioral patterns that concerned authorities. Some reports suggested he had been involved in unusual disturbances or suspicious behavior that led to temporary detention. In at least one instance, concerns about his mental state reportedly resulted in evaluation by authorities. Such incidents reinforced the impression that Nelson was struggling to maintain stability. But despite these warning signs, he remained freed in the early 20th century. Legal systems had limited tools for managing individuals whose behavior seemed unstable but not clearly criminal. Without a major offense, there was little justification for long-term supervision. S.O. Nelson continued, moving from town to town, from job to job, from one temporary room to another. And during these years of wandering, the psychological tensions that had shaped his life since childhood continued to grow. By the mid-1920s, the internal pressures that defined his early life were reaching a point where they could no longer remain hidden. The quiet traveler drifting across the country was about to enter a phase of life that would draw the attention of investigators across two nations, because somewhere along those restless journeys, the man shaped by injury, isolation, and inner conflict began to act on impulses that would soon bring his name into newspaper headlines. And once that transformation began, it would unfold with a speed and intensity that shocked communities across North America. The next chapter of his story would reveal the earliest signs that the troubled man wandering through cities was becoming something far more dangerous. Chapter 4: The Early Signs of a Dangerous Mind. By the early 1920s, the life of Earle Leonard Nelson had become defined by movement, uncertainty, and a growing sense of internal instability. The young man who had once been a quiet child under the strict supervision of his grandmother was now an adult drifting through cities, rarely staying long enough in one place to establish meaningful roots. On the surface, Nelson appeared to live a life similar to thousands of other men during that era. Economic conditions in the United States often forced workers to travel frequently. Railroads connected cities across the country, and temporary labor opportunities encouraged mobility. Men carrying suitcases moved between towns every day. But for Nelson, this movement was not simply about work. It had become a way of life. Each new city offered something he seemed to need: anonymity. No one knew his past. No one recognized the subtle behavioral changes that had followed his childhood injury or the emotional conflicts that had shaped his adolescence. In every new location, he could appear as a stranger starting fresh. Yet this freedom from recognition also meant freedom from accountability. And over time, investigators would later realize that Nelson's behavior was beginning to change in ways that hinted at darker impulses forming beneath the surface. The early warning signs did not initially appear as violent crimes. Instead, they emerged through smaller incidents that suggested growing instability. Some acquaintances recalled that Nelson occasionally behaved in ways that seemed strangely detached from reality. Conversations could take unusual turns, with Nelson sometimes speaking about morality, guilt, or religious fears with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to ordinary situations. He appeared haunted by internal thoughts that others could not see. At times, he seemed deeply anxious about spiritual consequences, as if convinced that unseen forces were judging his actions. But in other moments, those same concerns appeared to vanish, replaced by an eerie calmness. This unpredictable shift between Guilt and emotional detachment puzzled people who interacted with him, to employers and casual acquaintances. He might simply appear eccentric, but investigators studying his life years later would see these moments as early glimpses of a fractured psychological state. Another pattern also began to appear during this period. A fascination with situations where he could quietly observe people without drawing attention to himself. Boarding houses, for example, became a recurring part of Nelson's routine. These establishments were common across American cities, especially near railway stations where travelers frequently needed temporary lodging. The structure of these houses created a unique environment. Guests arrived quietly, often carrying luggage. They interacted briefly with the owner of the house, and then they disappeared into private rooms where they could remain unnoticed for days. For someone living a transient life, boarding houses were practical and inexpensive, but for Nelson, they may have offered something else, that a chance to observe, that a chance to understand how these homes operated. He likely noticed details others ignored. Many boarding houses were run by women who managed the property alone. Guests came and went frequently, and neighbors rarely paid attention to each individual visitor. In such an environment, a stranger could arrive and depart without attracting suspicion. These observations would later become deeply significant, but during the early 1920s, Nelson remained largely invisible to the wider world. He continued moving between cities, taking temporary work when available and disappearing when circumstances changed. The pattern of restlessness that had begun in his youth seemed impossible for him to escape. Yet the internal conflict that had once expressed itself through religious anxiety and emotional withdrawal appeared to be evolving into something more troubling. Some reports from this period suggest that Nelson occasionally demonstrated unusual physical intensity. Although he often appeared quiet and reserved, there were moments when his behavior shifted dramatically. People who encountered him during disagreements or tense situations sometimes described a sudden transformation. His posture would change, his voice would become sharper, and his physical movements seemed unexpectedly forceful. These moments were rare but memorable. They revealed that beneath the calm exterior was a capacity for sudden aggression that others did not anticipate. This dual nature, quiet and reserved one moment, intense and unpredictable the next, made Nelson difficult to understand. Even those who interacted with him regularly might never fully grasp the complexity of his behavior. But by the mid-1920s, the warning signs were becoming clearer. His life lacked stability, he had no lasting relationships. He moved frequently between cities where no one knew him well enough to recognize troubling patterns. And internally, the psychological conflicts that had shaped his youth appeared to be transforming into something darker. Criminal historians examining this stage of his life often emphasize an important idea. Dangerous behavior rarely emerges suddenly. Instead, it develops gradually through a combination of circumstances that slowly erode the boundaries between thought and action. For Nelson, those circumstances had been building for years. The strict moral environment of his childhood had created intense psychological pressure. The head injury he suffered in youth may have affected his emotional regulation. Isolation and constant travel removed the stabilizing influence of long-term relationships. Together, these factors created a foundation where troubling impulses could grow unchecked. And eventually, those impulses would begin to cross a threshold. The quiet traveler moving through American cities was approaching a moment when the thoughts that had troubled him for years would transform into actions that first. Those actions would not attract widespread attention. They would occur quietly, in private spaces where few witnesses were present. But as investigators later discovered, These early incidents represented the beginning of a pattern that would soon escalate dramatically, that a pattern that would eventually spread across cities, states, and even international borders. Because the man who had spent years drifting between towns was about to enter a phase of his life that would leave a permanent mark on criminal history. And the earliest signs of that transformation were already beginning to appear. By the mid-1920s, the life of Earle Leonard Nelson had reached a stage where the internal struggles that had shaped his earlier years were beginning to influence his outward actions in more visible ways. Though those who encountered him briefly, Nelson still appeared much the same as he always had. He was quiet, somewhat awkward in conversation, and rarely drew attention to himself. His clothing was typically neat but plain, and he often carried a small suitcase that reinforced the impression that he was simply another traveler moving from city to city. Yet the calm exterior hid a growing instability that investigators would only recognize years later when reconstructing his movements. During this period, Nelson's life became increasingly disconnected from ordinary social structures. He had no permanent residence, no steady employment, and very few relationships that lasted beyond short encounters. Each new city offered him a temporary place to exist, but none of them became a true home. This pattern of drifting created a unique psychological environment. When individuals live without long-term connections, the natural social boundaries that guide behavior can weaken. Friends, family members, and community ties often act as subtle reminders of responsibility and accountability. Nelson had none of those influences. He existed almost entirely outside the social networks that might have noticed his growing instability as he traveled. He became familiar with the rhythms of urban life in the 1920s. Railway stations, crowded streets, inexpensive restaurants, and boarding houses formed the landscape of his daily existence. Among these places, boarding houses remained particularly significant. They were common throughout North America during that era. Travelers frequently arrived late in the evening, seeking a temporary room before continuing their journey the next day. The arrangement required a degree of trust between the owner of the house and the guest that a brief conversation at the door was usually enough. If the traveler seemed polite and able to pay for the room, they were often welcomed inside. For Nelson, this system provided both convenience and anonymity. He could enter a home without attracting attention, stay quietly for a short period, and leave again without anyone asking many questions. Over time, investigators would come to believe that Nelson's repeated exposure to these environments allowed him to observe certain patterns. Many boarding houses were managed by women who lived alone. Guests came and went frequently. Neighbors rarely monitored who entered or left the home. The structure of these houses created private spaces where interactions occurred beyond the view of the outside world. Although there is no evidence that Nelson immediately recognized the potential consequences of these observations, it is clear that he became increasingly comfortable navigating such environments. Another change that occurred during this period involved his emotional responses to people around him. Those who interacted with Nelson occasionally described a strange absence of emotional warmth. While he could be polite and respectful in conversation, his reactions sometimes seemed mechanical, as though he were imitating social behavior rather than genuinely participating in it. This emotional distance may have been subtle, but it was noticeable enough that some individuals later remembered their encounters with him as slightly unsettling. Modern psychologists sometimes describe such behavior as a form of detachment, where individuals struggle to connect emotionally with others. That if Nelson experienced such detachment, it may have made it easier for him to view people not as individuals with feelings and lives of their own, but simply as figures passing through his environment. This perspective can gradually weaken empathy, a critical psychological barrier that normally prevents individuals from harming others. But perhaps the most troubling development during this period involved Nelson's growing unpredictability. Although he usually appeared calm, there were moments when his behavior changed suddenly. Witnesses from earlier encounters occasionally described brief incidents where his demeanor shifted dramatically during arguments or tense situations. His voice could become harsh, and his physical movements seemed unusually forceful. These moments were rare, but they revealed something important. Beneath the quiet surface was a capacity for sudden intensity. The contrast between his outward politeness and these occasional bursts of aggression created a dual personality that made him difficult to understand. One moment, he appeared timid. The next moment, he could become alarmingly forceful. This duality would later play a crucial role in the crimes investigators eventually linked to him, because the same quiet demeanor that allowed him to gain trust also helped him move unnoticed through communities. And when his behavior shifted suddenly, his victims often had little warning. Yet during the early 1920s, Nelson remained largely unknown to authorities. He was simply another traveler moving across a continent that was expanding rapidly with industry and opportunity. But within the pattern of his movements, investigators would later identify a gradual shift. His travels became more frequent. The distance between cities grew larger, and the restlessness that had once defined his lifestyle began to take on a different quality, one that suggested he was searching for something he could not easily find. Historians studying the case often emphasize that this stage of Nelson's life represents the final period before his actions escalated into crimes that would attract widespread attention. The warning signs were present: psychological instability, isolation, a lack of lasting relationships, and a growing familiarity with environments that offered both anonymity and opportunity. Yet none of these factors alone guaranteed what would happen next. Human behavior is shaped by countless influences, and predicting the moment when thoughts transform into actions is rarely possible. But for Nelson, that moment was approaching. Somewhere along the railway routes he traveled, somewhere within the cities where he rented temporary rooms, the internal conflicts that had followed him since childhood were reaching a point where they could no longer remain contained. The quiet traveler who knocked politely on doors would soon begin acting on impulses that had been building for years, and once those actions began, the pattern that followed would spread quickly. Communities across North America would soon begin hearing the same disturbing reports: a stranger arriving with a suitcase, a polite request for a room, and a disappearance that left investigators searching for answers. The transformation from restless traveler to notorious criminal was closer than anyone around Nelson could have imagined. And when that transformation finally occurred, it would mark the beginning of one of the most unsettling crime sprees of the 1920s. Chapter 5: America in the 1920s, a perfect hunting ground. To fully understand how Earle Leonard Nelson was able to move through cities and towns for so long without immediate capture, it is important to step back and look at the world in which he operated. The North America of the 1920s was a place very different from the one people know today. It was a decade defined by rapid growth, constant movement, and expanding transportation networks. Railroads connected distant regions, automobiles were becoming more common, and cities were growing at an extraordinary pace. For millions of people, this era offered opportunity, but for investigators trying to track a traveling criminal, it created enormous challenges. Communication between law enforcement agencies was slow and limited. Police departments operated largely within their own jurisdictions, and sharing information across state lines or across national borders was far more difficult than it is today. If a suspect committed a crime in one city and then boarded a train to another hundreds of miles away, local authorities often had no way of knowing who they were looking for. Descriptions might be sent by telegram or printed in newspapers, but by the time that information arrived in the next city, the suspect might already have moved on again. This environment made it possible for someone like Nelson to travel almost invisibly. Another important feature of the era was the widespread presence of boarding houses. These establishments existed in nearly every urban neighborhood. They served as temporary homes for travelers, seasonal workers, and individuals who needed inexpensive accommodation. The arrangement was simple that a homeowner, often a woman managing the property independently, rented out spare rooms to guests. Some boarding houses hosted long-term residents, while others catered to travelers staying only a night or two. For many people, these homes were essential parts of city life. Factories and railroads attracted workers from across the country, and not everyone could afford permanent housing. Boarding houses filled the gap, offering flexibility and convenience. But the same qualities that made them useful also created vulnerabilities. Guests arrived and departed frequently. Background checks were almost non-existent. Neighbors rarely paid attention to who entered or left the building. Trust formed the foundation of the system, but if someone appeared polite and able to pay for a room, they were usually welcomed inside without hesitation. For a quiet traveler carrying a suitcase, gaining access to such homes was remarkably easy. This social structure would later become central to the crimes investigators eventually linked to Nelson. But during the early years of his travels, boarding houses were simply part of the environment he moved through. Cities in the 1920s also had another characteristic that shaped daily life. Anonymity. As urban populations expanded, people became less connected to the communities around them. In smaller towns, neighbors often knew each other well, and strangers were quickly noticed. In large cities, however, thousands of unfamiliar faces passed through the streets every day. That a traveler arriving at a train station could blend into the crowd almost instantly. For someone seeking to remain unnoticed, this anonymity provided a powerful advantage. Nelson's lifestyle fit perfectly within this landscape. He traveled frequently, he stayed in temporary lodging, and he rarely remained in one place long enough to become familiar to local residents. Investigators later realized that his movements often followed railway routes that connected major cities with smaller towns. This pattern allowed him to move quickly while avoiding prolonged attention in any single location. Rail travel during that era was both efficient and inexpensive. A man could purchase a ticket and depart within hours, arriving in another city by the following day. And once he arrived, he could begin the same routine again, searching neighborhoods, looking for a boarding house, knocking on the door. From the perspective of law enforcement in the 1920s, this mobility made Nelson extremely difficult to track. Even when authorities began to suspect that a series of crimes might be connected, identifying the suspect was only the first challenge. Finding him was another matter entirely. He could be hundreds of miles away before investigators realized they were searching for the same person. The press played an important role in spreading awareness during this time. Newspapers were the primary source of information for most people, and dramatic crime stories often attracted widespread attention. When reports of mysterious deaths or disappearances began appearing in different cities, journalists sometimes noticed similarities that local investigators had not yet recognized. This was one of the ways the pattern eventually began to emerge. A quiet traveler at a rented room, and a tragedy discovered shortly afterward. First, these incidents appeared scattered across distant locations. But as reporters and detectives compared details, the possibility of a traveling offender slowly became more plausible. For communities reading these stories, The idea was deeply unsettling. People were accustomed to thinking of crime as something local, an event that occurred within a particular neighborhood or city. The notion that one individual could move across vast distances, committing crimes in multiple places, was far more difficult to comprehend. Yet the conditions of the 1920s made such movement entirely possible. Railways connected thousands of communities, cities offered anonymity and boarding. Houses provided easy access to private spaces where strangers could interact without witnesses. For Nelson, whether consciously or instinctively, these circumstances created an environment that allowed his behavior to escalate without immediate detection. The restless traveler who had spent years drifting between cities now found himself moving through a landscape uniquely suited to conceal his actions. And as investigators would soon discover, the crimes that followed were not random. They were shaped by the very structure of the society in which he lived. Understanding that environment helps explain how Nelson was able to operate for as long as he did. But it also reveals something equally important. The crimes that would soon shock communities across North America did not occur in isolation. They unfolded within a rapidly changing world where technology, transportation, and urban growth created opportunities that earlier generations could hardly imagine. For most people, those changes represented progress. For Nelson, they created the conditions that allowed his darkest impulses to emerge, and soon, those impulses would transform from thoughts into actions that left investigators struggling to understand how such events could occur. By the middle of the 1920s, the world that Earle Leonard Nelson moved through had become an enormous web of cities, railway stations, boarding houses, and anonymous streets. To ordinary travelers, this network represented opportunity and freedom. To investigators who would later study Nelson's movements, it revealed something else entirely, a landscape that unintentionally allowed a determined criminal to move almost undetected. The rhythm of daily life during this era played an important role in shaping that environment. Cities were busier than ever before. Factories operated long hours. Railways transported goods across vast distances, and workers moved between jobs as industries expanded. Neighborhoods near train stations were particularly active, filled with hotels, restaurants, boarding houses, and small shops serving travelers. In such places, strangers were a common sight. That a man arriving with a suitcase did not attract suspicion. He was simply another traveler passing through. For boarding house owners, this constant flow of unfamiliar guests was part of their livelihood. Many of them operated their homes as small businesses, renting rooms to help support themselves financially. Some had several long-term tenants, while others hosted short-term visitors who stayed only a night or two. That the arrangement depended heavily on trust. Guests were rarely asked many questions. If they appeared respectable and could pay for a room, they were usually welcomed inside. This simple system had worked for decades, but as investigators would later realize, it also created a vulnerability. Inside these houses, interactions occurred privately. The owner and the guest might be alone in the building, especially during the daytime when other residents were away at work. Neighbors often paid little attention to the routine movements of people entering or leaving the house. In this environment, someone with harmful intentions could act quickly and disappear before anyone noticed something was wrong. When historians later mapped Nelson's travels, they discovered that many of his movements followed a similar pattern. He arrived quietly in a new city, explored neighborhoods near transportation routes, and located boarding houses where rooms were available. From the outside, his behavior seemed completely ordinary. He was simply searching for a place to stay. But investigators eventually realized that his visits often followed a disturbingly consistent structure. He would knock on the door, introduce himself politely, ask whether a room was available. Once inside, he gained access to the private spaces of the home. What happened afterward would later become the focus of intense investigation at the time. However, there was no reason for the women who ran these houses to suspect anything unusual. Nelson appeared calm and respectful that he rarely caused disturbances, and he often left quickly, moving on to another city before anyone had reason to question him. This mobility became one of his most powerful advantages. Railway networks in the 1920s allowed passengers to travel long distances rapidly compared to earlier generations. A person could depart one city in the evening and arrive hundreds of miles away by morning. For law enforcement agencies operating with limited communication systems, this speed created a major obstacle. If a crime occurred in one town, local police might begin investigating immediately. But if the suspect boarded a train and traveled to another state or even another country, identifying and locating them became extremely difficult. Messages had to be sent by telegram or written. Reports, descriptions of suspects might appear in newspapers days later. By that time, the suspect might already be in another city far beyond the reach of the original investigation. Nelson seemed to understand this dynamic instinctively. He rarely lingered in one location after an incident. Instead, he continued moving along transportation routes that allowed him to disappear into new communities. This pattern would later lead investigators to describe him as one of the earliest examples of a traveling serial killer operating across multiple jurisdictions. But during the early stages of his crimes, the pattern was not immediately obvious. Each city saw only its own tragedy. Local authorities treated each case separately, and the man responsible quietly continued his travels. The press would eventually begin noticing similarities between incidents in different locations, but that realization took time. Until then, Nelson's movements remained largely unconnected to the broader cultural environment of the 1920s also played a role in how these crimes were perceived. Society at that time still believed strongly in the idea that dangerous criminals were easy to recognize. Popular imagination often pictured violent offenders as rough, aggressive individuals who stood out from ordinary citizens. Nelson did not fit that image. He appeared quiet and somewhat timid. He spoke politely. He dressed like any other traveler. This contrast between expectation and reality allowed him to move through communities without attracting attention. People simply did not see him as a threat. Yet beneath that calm appearance, investigators would later discover a pattern of behavior that revealed a far more disturbing reality. The man who knocked politely on doors was not simply searching for a place to sleep. He was beginning to act on impulses that had been forming for years, and the environment of the 1920s, with its expanding cities, anonymous crowds, and trusting boarding house system, allowed those impulses to escalate in ways that few people at the time could fully understand. Soon, the quiet traveler moving between railway stations and rented rooms would leave behind a trail of incidents that investigators could no longer dismiss as isolated tragedies. Communities across the United States and Canada would begin hearing the same unsettling reports, the stranger arriving with luggage at a polite request for accommodation, and then a discovery that left authorities searching desperately for answers. The conditions of the era had created the perfect landscape for someone like Nelson to operate. But the pattern of his actions was about to become far more visible because the next phase of his life would mark the moment when the restless traveler transformed into something far more dangerous. And once that transformation occurred, the series of events that followed would capture the attention of investigators across an entire continent. Chapter 6: The First Confirmed Murders. By the time Earle Leonard Nelson reached the mid-1920s, the long years of wandering that defined his adult life had begun to take a darker direction. For nearly a decade, he had drifted quietly between cities, rarely leaving a lasting impression on the communities he passed through. But something within him was changing. The psychological conflicts that had shaped his childhood and adolescence, strict moral upbringing, emotional isolation, and the lingering effects of his head injury were no longer contained beneath the surface. The internal tension that had followed him for years was now beginning to manifest in actions that would eventually draw the attention of investigators across North America. At first, these incidents did not immediately reveal a clear pattern that in different cities, at different times, authorities encountered cases that seemed confusing and difficult to explain. A boarding house owner might be discovered deceased under unusual circumstances, or a resident might suddenly disappear without any clear explanation. In many of these early cases, investigators initially suspected robbery or personal disputes, but as time passed, certain details began to stand out. Many of the incidents involved women who operated boarding houses or rented rooms in their homes. These women often lived alone or managed their properties with minimal assistance. Their businesses relied on accepting guests who appeared respectable and able to pay for a room. This trust was a necessary part of the arrangement. Yet it also meant that strangers could gain access to the interior of the home with very little scrutiny. In one of the earliest cases later linked to Nelson, the situation began in a way that seemed completely ordinary. A traveler arrived looking for a room. He appeared polite, spoke calmly, and carried a suitcase that suggested he was simply passing through the city. The boarding house owner welcomed him inside, likely assuming he was another temporary guest among many she had hosted before. Nothing about the interaction appeared unusual at the time. Neighbors did not report any disturbance, and no immediate warning signs suggested that anything dangerous had occurred. But after the guest departed, the situation inside the house took a disturbing turn. Authorities were eventually called to investigate when the homeowner could not be located or when suspicious. Circumstances within the residence raised concern. In cases like this, investigators faced enormous challenges. Without witnesses or clear evidence, it was difficult to reconstruct what had happened inside the private spaces of the home. The guest who had rented the room might have already left the city, traveling hundreds of miles away before anyone realized that something was wrong. This pattern allowed Nelson to remain largely invisible during the early stages of his crimes. Each incident occurred within its own isolated environment. Each investigation focused on the immediate surroundings rather than searching for connections across distant cities. But over time, similarities between the cases began to emerge. The victims were often women living alone. The incidents occurred shortly after a new guest had arrived, and the mysterious traveler who had rented a room often disappeared shortly afterward. For detectives examining these cases individually, the pattern was difficult to see, but when later investigators looked back and compared timelines, the connections became clearer. During this period, Nelson's movements continued to follow the railway routes that connected cities across the United States. He rarely stayed in one location for long, and his travel schedule allowed him to leave an area before suspicions could fully develop. This mobility was a key factor in his ability to avoid immediate capture. Another detail that puzzled investigators involved the apparent lack of financial motive in some cases. Although small items occasionally went missing, robbery did not appear to be the primary objective. The crime seemed to follow a pattern that suggested something more complex than simple theft. Authorities at the time struggled to interpret this behavior. The concept of a serial killer driven by psychological impulses rather than financial gain was not widely understood during the 1920s. Most criminal investigations focused on practical motives such as money, revenge, or personal conflict. The idea that someone might travel from city to city committing violent acts without clear financial incentive was difficult for many investigators to comprehend. Yet that was precisely the pattern that was beginning to emerge. Nelson's behavior suggested a disturbing mixture of planning and impulse. He selected environments where he could enter a home easily. He targeted individuals who were likely to be alone, and he departed quickly before authorities could begin searching for him. This combination of careful observation and sudden action made his crimes especially difficult to prevent. But the early cases still did not attract widespread national attention. Each community saw only its own tragedy. Newspapers reported the incidents locally, sometimes speculating about possible suspects or motives. But the broader pattern remained hidden. For Nelson, this lack of coordination between investigations created an opportunity. He continued traveling, city after city, boarding house after boarding house, and with each incident, the pattern grew more established. But the scale of his actions was about to increase in a way that would eventually force authorities to recognize that something far more serious was unfolding. Because as Nelson's crimes continued, they would no longer remain confined to isolated locations. Soon, the similarities between cases would become too striking to ignore, and once investigators began connecting those events, the quiet traveler who had moved unnoticed through so many communities would suddenly become the focus of a continent-wide search. But at this stage, the pattern was still forming. The man responsible remained just another stranger arriving at the door with a suitcase, the traveler asking politely for a room, and leaving behind a mystery that authorities had not yet learned how to solve. As investigators later reconstructed the movements of Earle Leonard Nelson, the scattered incidents that once seemed unrelated began to form a clearer timeline. What had originally appeared to be isolated tragedies in different cities slowly revealed themselves as part of a disturbing pattern. During the mid-1920s, Nelson's travels intensified. His movement between towns became more frequent, often following railway routes that allowed him to leave quickly after arriving. Train stations served as the starting point for many of his visits. From there, he would walk through nearby neighborhoods searching for places that offered temporary lodging. Boarding houses remained central to this pattern. These homes were often modest buildings where spare rooms had been converted into rental spaces. In many cases, the owner lived on the premises and managed the business personally. Guests were usually greeted at the door and shown their rooms after a brief conversation. For Nelson, the process was straightforward. He approached the house calmly, he introduced himself politely, and he asked if a room was available. Tio, the owner of the house. He appeared to be just another traveler in need of a place to stay. But investigators later concluded that Nelson's visits were rarely accidental. He seemed to choose homes where the owner was likely to be alone. The absence of other residents reduced the chances that someone might interrupt or witness what happened inside. Once he gained access to the home, events unfolded quickly. The details of these incidents varied, but the overall pattern remained consistent enough that detectives eventually recognized the similarities. The attack occurred suddenly, leaving little opportunity for resistance. Afterward, Nelson often left the property quietly, sometimes taking small personal items before departing. Then he disappeared. Within hours, he might be walking toward a railway station, preparing to board a train to another city where no one knew his name. For local investigators, the lack of witnesses made these cases extremely difficult to solve. Without clear descriptions of the suspect, identifying the individual responsible was almost impossible. Neighbors might remember seeing a traveler enter the house earlier in the day, but such observations rarely provided enough information to locate him. It'd be why the time authorities began asking questions. Nelson was often hundreds of miles away. Another factor complicated the investigation. The crimes occurred across different jurisdictions. Police departments in one city rarely communicated regularly with authorities in distant regions. Each investigation remained confined to the location where the incident occurred. As a result, detectives in one state might never learn that a similar crime had taken place somewhere else only weeks earlier. It was not until journalists and law enforcement officials began comparing reports that the possibility of a traveling offender became more widely discussed. Newspaper articles from different regions started describing incidents with strikingly similar circumstances, that a stranger renting a room, a sudden disappearance or tragedy inside the home, and a guest who vanished shortly afterward. These similarities gradually raised suspicions that the same individual might be responsible, but identifying that individual remained a daunting challenge. During this stage of the investigation, Nelson still moved largely unnoticed. He blended easily into the crowds of busy cities. His appearance did not draw attention, and the lack of coordinated communication between police departments allowed him to continue traveling without immediate pursuit. Yet with each new incident, the urgency of the situation grew. Authorities began realizing that the crimes were not random. They followed a consistent structure. The victims were often women operating boarding houses. The suspect arrived as a traveler seeking a room, and the incident occurred soon after the guest entered the home. This pattern suggested planning rather than coincidence. The man responsible understood how these homes operated. He understood how to gain entry, and he understood how quickly he needed to leave afterward. For criminal investigators of the 1920s, this realization marked a turning point. They were no longer searching for a local offender. They were searching for someone who moved continuously between cities, someone who might already be on the move again before the investigation even began. The growing awareness of this possibility began to alarm communities across the region. Boarding house owners became more cautious about accepting unfamiliar guests. Some newspapers advised readers to verify the identity of travelers before allowing them inside their homes. Yet despite these precautions, the man responsible continued to operate. His movements remained unpredictable, and his ability to disappear after each incident made him one of the most elusive suspects investigators had encountered. Looking back today, historians often describe this period as the stage when Nelson's crimes first became recognizable. As part of a broader pattern, the quiet traveler drifting across the country was no longer invisible. His actions were beginning to draw attention, but the full scale of his crimes was still not fully understood. Investigators had identified a troubling connection between several cases, yet they had not yet realized how far Nelson's travels would take him, because soon his movements would extend beyond the borders of the United States. The search for the man responsible would expand into an international investigation, and communities across two nations would begin hearing the same unsettling reports about a traveler whose visits left behind a trail of unanswered questions. The quiet stranger with the suitcase was becoming more than just a suspect. He was becoming a mystery that authorities across North America were determined to solve. Chapter 7. A pattern begins to emerge. By the time investigators began examining the movements of Earle Leonard Nelson, something unsettling had started to take shape across multiple cities. What had once appeared to be isolated incidents, each tragic in its own way, was slowly forming a pattern that could no longer be ignored. The early investigations had been limited by geography. Police departments worked within their own jurisdictions. If a crime occurred in one city, the assumption was that the person responsible lived nearby or had some connection to the community. Detectives focused on local suspects, interviewing neighbors, questioning acquaintances, and examining anyone who might have had a reason to commit the crime. But as the number of similar cases increased, those traditional methods began to fail. Each investigation reached the same frustrating conclusion. The suspect was gone. Witnesses might recall a quiet traveler renting a room or asking about accommodations, but no one knew his name with certainty. Descriptions were vague. An ordinary-looking man, neatly dressed, carrying luggage. Nothing about him stood out strongly enough to identify him later. For a long time, these scattered clues remained unconnected. But gradually, newspapers and law enforcement officials began comparing details. The similarities were difficult to dismiss. The victims were often women who managed boarding houses or rented rooms in their homes. The suspect arrived alone, presenting himself as a traveler looking for a place to stay. The incident occurred shortly after his arrival, and by the time authorities began searching for him, he had disappeared. This pattern began appearing in multiple cities across the western United States during the mid-1920s. Each case reinforced the growing suspicion that a single individual might be responsible. For investigators, this realization was both alarming and confusing at the time. The concept of a serial killer operating across multiple jurisdictions was not widely understood. Most criminal investigations were built around the assumption that offenders committed crimes close to where they lived. But the evidence suggested something very different. Whoever was responsible for these incidents was moving constantly. That he appeared in one city, committed the crime, and then vanished, only to reappear somewhere else weeks later. Tracing such movements was extremely difficult in the 1920s. Travel records were limited. Identification documents were not always required, and railways allowed passengers to move quickly between cities without leaving detailed records of their journey. As detectives continued reviewing the cases, another unsettling detail began to emerge. Witnesses who had spoken briefly with the mysterious traveler often described the same personality traits. He appeared polite but soft-spoken. Sometimes even shy. He did not behave like the aggressive or intimidating criminals people imagine when thinking about violent offenders. Instead, he seemed calm and respectful. This contrast between appearance and action made the case especially disturbing. It meant that the suspect could gain the trust of his victims easily. The polite traveler asking for a room did not appear threatening. He looked like someone who needed help, not someone who posed a danger. For boarding house owners, turning away such a guest might have seemed unnecessary or even unkind. And that moment of trust was all Nelson needed. Once inside the home, events unfolded quickly. Investigators would later discover that his attacks were often sudden and forceful, leaving little opportunity for resistance. The speed of the incident meant that neighbors rarely heard anything unusual from the outside. The house remained quiet. Nothing seemed out of place, and the traveler who had entered earlier might already be leaving the neighborhood. This pattern repeated itself in city after city, but despite the similarities, identifying the suspect remained difficult. Descriptions of his appearance varied slightly depending on the witness. Some remembered him as slightly hunched in posture. Others recalled his intense gaze or his unusual way of observing his surroundings. But none of these details were precise enough to produce an accurate identification. Still, detectives continued searching for connections. They began studying railway routes. They examined travel patterns between cities where the incidents had occurred, and gradually, a possible timeline began to emerge. The same man might have been moving through multiple regions, committing crimes, and then traveling quickly to avoid detection. For law enforcement officials of the era, this possibility represented a new and frightening challenge. If the suspect was truly traveling across states, it meant that solving the case would require cooperation between different police departments, something that was not always easy to organize. Information had to be exchanged through telegrams or written reports. Descriptions of the suspect might be printed in newspapers or circulated through law enforcement bulletins. But even with these efforts, the investigation moved slowly. Meanwhile, the man responsible continued his travels, city after city, street after street, boarding house after boarding house, and with each new incident, the pattern became clearer. What had once been a series of mysteries was now beginning to resemble something far more organized, that a deliberate method, that a routine, that a system that allowed the offender to operate quietly within the ordinary routines of urban life. The quiet traveler who knocked politely on doors was becoming the center of one of the most perplexing investigations of the decade. Yet the most alarming discovery still lay ahead. Because as authorities examined the timeline of events more carefully, they realized something even more troubling. The crimes were not slowing down. They were accelerating. The man responsible was becoming more active, and his movements were about to extend beyond the borders of the United States. Soon, the investigation would expand into an international search, and the mysterious traveler who had eluded authorities for so long would become the focus of attention across two nations. As detectives continued examining the growing number of cases linked to the mysterious traveler, the outline of a disturbing pattern became clearer. What had once been a collection of isolated incidents now appeared connected through a series of repeating details. Investigators in different cities began realizing that they might all be searching for the same individual. The center of that growing realization was Earle Leonard Nelson, though at the time many investigators still did not know his name. Instead, they were working with fragments, descriptions from witnesses, timelines from boarding house records, and newspaper reports from other cities describing events that looked strikingly similar. One of the most revealing aspects of the investigation involved the timing of the crimes. Detectives noticed that incidents often occurred shortly after a new guest arrived at a boarding house. In some cases, neighbors remembered seeing a stranger enter the home earlier that day or the evening before. But after the event was discovered, the guest had already vanished. This repeated sequence, arrival, incident, disappearance, suggested that the offender had developed a method. He moved quickly. He avoided prolonged contact with neighbors or other residents, and he left the area as soon as possible. Investigators also noticed something unusual about the geographic spread of the cases. Many of the cities involved were connected by major railway routes. This discovery led detectives to consider the possibility that the suspect was traveling primarily by train. In the 1920s, trains were the fastest and most reliable form of long-distance transportation. A passenger could depart one city in the evening and arrive hundreds of miles away by morning. Tickets were relatively inexpensive, and identification requirements were minimal. For someone attempting to avoid detection, the railway system offered an ideal escape route. That if Nelson committed a crime in one city, he could simply board a train and begin the journey toward another destination before local authorities even realized what had happened. This mobility was one of the reasons he remained difficult to capture during the early stages of the investigation. Another detail that investigators found intriguing involved Nelson's outward behavior. Unlike many criminals who attracted attention through aggressive or reckless conduct, Nelson appeared remarkably composed during his interactions with others. Witnesses frequently described him as polite, quiet, and respectful. Some even recalled feeling sympathy for him, believing he was simply a traveler searching for a place to rest. This demeanor allowed him to enter homes without raising suspicion. In many cases, boarding house owners likely saw no reason to question his presence. Travelers were a normal part of their daily routine, and Nelson presented himself exactly as such. But investigators would later realize that this calm exterior concealed a very different reality. Behind the polite conversation and quiet demeanor was a man capable of sudden and intense aggression. This contrast between appearance and action made the crimes particularly difficult to predict. Neighbors might remember seeing the traveler earlier in the day, but nothing about his behavior suggested danger to them. He was simply another guest. Yet as detectives compared cases, they began noticing that witnesses often mentioned the same physical characteristics. Nelson was not especially large, but he appeared physically strong. His posture sometimes seemed slightly hunched, and his eyes were frequently described as intense or unusually focused. These descriptions were still too general to produce a reliable identification, but they provided investigators with a clearer image of the person they were searching for. Meanwhile, newspapers across different regions began reporting on the growing mystery. Journalists were quick to recognize the dramatic nature of the story. A traveling offender moving between cities, leaving behind a trail of unexplained incidents, captured the public imagination. Articles speculated about the identity of the suspect. Some reporters referred to him as a wandering criminal moving across the country. Others suggested that the cases might involve more than one offender. At that stage, the truth remained uncertain. But one fact was becoming impossible to ignore. The crimes were connected. Authorities across multiple jurisdictions were likely searching for the same individual, and that individual was still freed. As the investigation expanded, police departments began exchanging information more actively. Descriptions of the suspect were circulated through law enforcement bulletins. Detectives in different cities compared notes, attempting to identify patterns in the suspect's movements. Slowly, the idea of a traveling offender gained acceptance. But even as investigators began coordinating their efforts, the man they were searching for continued moving. The same railway routes that connected the cities of the United States also extended north into Canada, and soon, reports from Canadian communities would begin describing incidents that looked eerily similar to those already being investigated in American cities. The mysterious traveler had crossed an international border. What had begun as a regional investigation was about to become something much larger. Police departments in two countries would soon find themselves searching for the same man, that a quiet stranger carrying a suitcase, the traveler who appeared polite and harmless, and a suspect whose movements had become one of the most perplexing mysteries of the decade. The pattern was now undeniable, but identifying the man responsible and stopping him remained an enormous challenge. Because the traveler known to investigators only through scattered descriptions was still moving from city to city, and his journey was far from over. Chapter 8: Crossing Borders. The killer expands his range. By the time investigators in several American cities began suspecting that a single individual might be responsible for a series of disturbing crimes, Earle Leonard Nelson was already moving far beyond the areas where the earliest incidents had occurred. His movements had always followed a restless rhythm, city after city, boarding house after boarding house. A quiet arrival, a brief stay, and then another departure. But now the scale of his travels was expanding. The same railway lines that connected cities across the United States also extended northward into Canada, linking American transportation networks with major Canadian hubs. These routes were used every day by business travelers, laborers, immigrants, and tourists moving between the two countries. For Nelson, crossing the border required little effort. During the 1920s, international travel between the United States and Canada was relatively simple. Identification checks were minimal compared to modern standards, and travelers could often pass through border crossings with little more than a ticket and basic questioning. A quiet man carrying luggage rarely attracted much attention. And so Nelson continued his journey. Investigators would later determine that by this stage of his crimes, he had developed a routine that allowed him to operate with remarkable efficiency. First came the arrival in a new city. Often he chose locations near railway stations or busy urban districts where travelers were common. These neighborhoods were filled with boarding houses, inexpensive hotels, and restaurants catering to people passing through. From the station, Nelson would walk through the surrounding streets. He appeared to observe the area carefully, looking for signs that a boarding house was operating within the neighborhood. These homes were often easy to identify. Small signs in windows advertised rooms for rent, and the steady movement of guests entering or leaving the property made their purpose clear. Once Nelson identified a suitable location, he approached the door calmly to anyone watching. There was nothing unusual about the scene that a traveler knocking politely at a brief conversation with the homeowner, and then the guest being welcomed inside. The routine repeated itself in city after city, but now it was occurring across national boundaries. When similar incidents began appearing in Canadian communities, local investigators initially treated them as independent cases. Yet the details soon raised familiar questions. The victims were often women managing boarding houses or renting rooms in their homes. The suspect had appeared as a quiet traveler seeking accommodation, and after the incident occurred, the guest had vanished. As detectives compared reports from different regions, the similarities became difficult to dismiss. Canadian authorities began reviewing newspaper reports from the United States describing earlier incidents. The pattern looked strikingly familiar: that a traveler at a rented room and a disappearance. For investigators, this realization marked a turning point. The person responsible was no longer operating within a single country. He was moving freely between two nations. This expansion of the investigation created new challenges. Communication between American and Canadian law enforcement agencies was slower and less organized then. It would be today. Messages had to be transmitted through official channels, and gathering detailed information about suspects could take days or even weeks. Meanwhile, the man they were searching for continued moving. One of the most unsettling aspects of Nelson's crimes during this period was how easily he blended into his surroundings. Witness descriptions rarely portrayed him as threatening. That he appeared calm, sometimes even shy. His quiet demeanor made him seem harmless. This contrast between appearance and action became a defining characteristic of his behavior. People who encountered him briefly often felt no reason to be alarmed. That he spoke politely, he carried himself like an ordinary traveler. And in the bustling urban environments of the 1920s, there was little reason to question such a person. Yet investigators gradually realized that behind this calm exterior was a carefully repeating pattern of behavior. Nelson chose environments where strangers were common. He selected victims who were likely to be alone, and he departed quickly before suspicions could develop. This method allowed him to continue traveling even as awareness of the crimes began spreading. Newspaper articles in both countries started discussing the possibility that a single offender might be responsible for incidents occurring across different regions. Readers followed the story with growing fascination and concern. The idea that a mysterious traveler might be moving from city to city committing crimes was deeply unsettling. Communities began warning boarding house owners to exercise greater caution when accepting unfamiliar guests. Some establishments started asking more questions before renting rooms. But the system of trust that had defined boarding houses for decades could not be changed overnight. Travelers still needed accommodation, and strangers still knocked on doors every day. For Nelson, this environment continued to provide opportunities. The railway lines carried him from city to city. Each new destination offered anonymity. Each new boarding house offered access to a private space. Yet as his movements expanded into Canada, something else began to change. The growing awareness of the crimes meant that investigators were now paying closer attention. Descriptions of the suspect were circulating more widely. Police departments were beginning to compare information, and slowly, the mysterious traveler who had remained anonymous for so long was becoming the focus of a much larger search. But at this stage of the investigation, his name was still not widely known. Authorities were searching for a man described only through fragments of witness accounts that a quiet stranger, the traveler with a suitcase. Someone who appeared ordinary enough to pass unnoticed in almost any city. Yet behind that ordinary appearance was a pattern of behavior that investigators were only beginning to understand. And the more they studied that pattern, the clearer it became that the crimes were not random. They were deliberate, methodical, and increasingly difficult to ignore. The search for the man responsible was expanding, but so was his range of movement. And as Nelson continued traveling across borders, the mystery surrounding his identity was about to become the subject of one of the most intense manhunts of the decade. As the investigation spread across national boundaries, the name Earle Leonard Nelson slowly began appearing in police discussions more frequently. What had once been a collection of vague descriptions was gradually evolving into a clearer identity. Yet at the moment Nelson entered Canada, most communities still had no idea that a traveling offender might be moving through their neighborhoods. For the man himself, crossing into another country likely felt like nothing more than another step in the long pattern of movement that had defined his life for years. He had already spent much of his adulthood drifting between cities across the United States. The border between nations represented little more than another railway stop along the journey. Canadian cities during the 1920s shared many of the same characteristics as the American communities Nelson had previously visited: busy railway stations, growing urban districts, boarding houses that catered to travelers and workers. The familiar structure of these neighborhoods meant that Nelson could continue the same routine that had worked for him before. He arrived quietly that he walked through streets near the train station, and he searched for houses that advertised rooms for rent. The people who lived in these communities had little reason to suspect that the stranger knocking at their door might already be connected to incidents in another country. For them, he appeared to be simply another traveler moving through the city, polite but soft-spoken, carrying a suitcase. Investigators later noted that Nelson's ability to appear ordinary was one of the most important factors in how long he was able to avoid capture. Many criminals attract attention through reckless or aggressive behavior, but Nelson's quiet demeanor allowed him to blend easily into everyday life. When he approached a boarding house, he did so calmly that he asked about available rooms in a respectful tone. Nothing about his behavior suggested urgency or hostility. This approach lowered suspicion. Boarding house owners had likely welcomed hundreds of travelers over the years, and Nelson appeared no different from the others. Yet within these ordinary interactions, the pattern that investigators had begun to identify continued repeating itself. Once inside the home, the situation changed quickly, and shortly afterward, the quiet traveler disappeared once again. The discovery of these incidents in Canadian cities caused immediate concern among local authorities. At first, investigators approached each case individually, focusing on suspects within the local area. But as details emerged, the similarities to earlier incidents in the United States became difficult to ignore. Reports began moving between police departments on both sides of the border. Descriptions of the mysterious traveler circulated through law enforcement bulletins, and gradually, detectives started realizing that they were likely searching for the same man. For communities reading newspaper reports during this period, the story was both fascinating and unsettling. Articles described a quiet stranger moving between cities, a traveler whose visits seemed to be followed by tragedy. The idea that one individual could cross international borders while committing crimes created a sense of urgency among authorities. If the suspect could travel freely between the United States and Canada, stopping him would require cooperation between multiple police agencies. But cooperation in the 1920s was far more complicated than it would be today. Communication relied on telegrams, written reports, and telephone conversations between distant offices. Gathering detailed information about suspects took time, and investigators often had to work with incomplete descriptions. Meanwhile, Nelson continued moving. Railway routes carried him through new cities where no one recognized his face. Each stop offered another opportunity to disappear among unfamiliar crowds. For detectives following the investigation, the situation became increasingly frustrating. They knew the crimes were connected. They knew the suspect was traveling, but finding him within a continent filled with busy railways and growing cities seemed almost impossible. Still, progress was slowly being made. The growing number of cases allowed investigators to assemble a clearer profile of the suspect. Witness descriptions, although incomplete, began forming a consistent image that a man of average height, slightly hunched posture, quiet and reserved demeanor, and intense eyes that several witnesses remembered vividly. These details were shared among police departments and published in some newspapers, helping spread awareness among the public. For the first time, the mysterious traveler was no longer completely anonymous. Authorities were beginning to understand who they were searching for. Yet, even as this awareness grew, Nelson's journey continued. He moved through communities that had not yet heard the warnings. He entered neighborhoods where boarding houses still welcomed travelers, and he departed quickly before investigators could arrive. But the growing number of incidents meant that the investigation was gaining momentum. Police departments were coordinating their efforts more actively. Newspaper coverage was spreading information across both countries and somewhere along the railway routes that connected North America's cities. The man responsible was moving closer to the moment when his travels would finally come to an end, because the search for him was becoming larger with every passing week. What had begun as scattered investigations in different towns had evolved into an international manhunt, and soon, that manhunt would bring authorities face to face with the quiet traveler who had eluded them for so long. Chapter 9: The International Manhunt. By the time law enforcement authorities in both the United States and Canada began seriously comparing notes, the mystery surrounding Earle Leonard Nelson had transformed from a series of isolated cases into one of the most alarming criminal investigations of the 1920s. For the first time, investigators were beginning to understand the true scale of what they were facing. What had once appeared to be individual incidents scattered across distant cities now revealed a disturbing pattern that crossed state lines and international borders. The quiet traveler who appeared briefly in boarding houses before vanishing had left behind a trail of crimes stretching across vast distances. And yet, despite the growing awareness of his actions, he remained at large. The realization that a single individual might be responsible for incidents in multiple regions forced authorities to rethink their investigative strategies. Local police departments were accustomed to solving crimes within their own communities, focusing on suspects who lived nearby or had personal connections to the victims. But Nelson did not fit that pattern. He was a stranger everywhere he went. He left each city quickly, and he seemed to choose locations where no one knew him well enough to recognize him later. This mobility created a problem that law enforcement agencies of the era were not fully prepared to solve. Communication between jurisdictions was limited. Police departments relied on telegrams, letters, and occasional telephone calls to exchange information. Sharing detailed reports across large distances could take days or even weeks to be why the time one department received information about a suspect, that individual might already be far away. Nevertheless, investigators began working together in ways that were unusual for the time. Descriptions of the mysterious traveler were circulated among police agencies across both countries. Officers compared witness statements from different cities, looking for similarities in the suspect's appearance and behavior. Gradually, a more consistent image of the man they were searching for began to emerge. He was described as quiet and reserved. His posture sometimes appeared slightly hunched, and his eyes were often noted as intense, giving the impression that he was carefully observing everything around him. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the investigation was how ordinary he appeared. Witnesses rarely described him as threatening. Instead, they remembered him as polite and soft-spoken, someone who seemed almost shy. This calm demeanor had allowed him to gain the trust of the people he encountered. Boarding house owners welcomed him inside because he appeared respectful. Neighbors noticed him but did not suspect danger. He blended easily into the everyday life of the cities he visited. And that ability to appear harmless made him extremely difficult to identify. As awareness of the crime spread, newspapers began covering the story more extensively. Articles described the possibility of a traveling offender moving between cities, leaving behind incidents that seemed disturbingly similar. Some reports speculated about the identity of the suspect, while others warned communities to be cautious when accepting unfamiliar guests. For readers, the story was both fascinating and frightening. The idea that a single person could move across vast distances committing crimes challenged the traditional understanding of criminal behavior. Most people believed that dangerous offenders operated within specific communities. The possibility that someone might travel from city to city committing crimes was difficult to comprehend. Yet the evidence suggested that this was exactly what was happening. Authorities began monitoring railway stations more closely, hoping that someone might recognize the suspect from the descriptions being circulated. But the challenge remained enormous. Railway stations were among the busiest places in any city. Hundreds or even thousands of passengers passed through each day. Identifying one quiet traveler among such crowds was like searching for a single face in a sea of strangers. Meanwhile, Nelson continued moving through the transportation network that connected the continent. His routine remained largely unchanged. Arrive quietly, search for lodging, stay briefly, and then depart before attracting attention. Yet despite his continued movement, the investigation was slowly closing in. Each new incident provided investigators with additional clues. Each witness description added another piece to the puzzle, and with every passing week, the image of the suspect became clearer. Detectives began narrowing their focus toward a specific individual whose name had started appearing in connection with earlier disturbances and suspicious behavior. That name was Earle Leonard Nelson. As investigators examined records and previous encounters with law enforcement, they began realizing that Nelson's past contained several details that matched the patterns they had been observing. His history of constant travel, his periods of instability, and his presence in locations where some of the earlier incidents had occurred. These discoveries strengthened the belief that Nelson might indeed be the man they were searching for, but confirming that suspicion and locating him remained the most difficult challenge of all. Because the suspect was still traveling, still moving from city to city, and still blending into the ordinary flow of people passing through railway stations and boarding houses across North America. The international manhunt had begun, but the man at the center of it remained just out of reach. As the investigation intensified, Authorities on both sides of the border were now focusing their attention on a single suspect, Earle Leonard Nelson. What had once been a vague description of a traveling stranger was now slowly becoming a real identity with a documented history. For detectives studying the case, Nelson's background began to explain many of the puzzling elements that had frustrated investigators for so long. He had lived a transient life. He had moved frequently between cities, and he had demonstrated signs of psychological instability during earlier encounters with authorities. These details aligned closely with the behavior detectives had been tracking, but identifying Nelson as the suspect was only the beginning. Finding him was another challenge entirely. At the time, law enforcement systems lacked the centralized coordination that modern investigators rely on. There were no national databases, no instant communication networks, and no coordinated surveillance systems. Information traveled slowly, and Nelson was still moving quickly. Authorities distributed his description widely through police bulletins and newspaper reports. Officers at railway stations were advised to remain alert for travelers who matched the descriptions circulating through law enforcement channels. Yet the difficulty remained enormous. Railway stations were crowded places filled with travelers from every region of the continent. Men carrying suitcases arrived and departed constantly. One quiet passenger among hundreds was almost impossible to identify. Despite these challenges, the growing publicity surrounding the case began to change the environment Nelson was moving through. People were talking about the mysterious traveler. Newspapers printed warnings about accepting unfamiliar guests. Boarding house owners became more cautious when renting rooms. Some began asking more questions before allowing strangers inside their homes. This growing awareness meant that Nelson's usual routine was becoming riskier. Where once he could move unnoticed, there were now communities actively watching for suspicious travelers. Investigators believed that the increasing pressure might eventually force him into making a mistake. And as events unfolded, that prediction would prove correct. During the summer of 1927, Nelson was traveling through Canada, continuing the pattern that had defined his movements for years. He arrived in new communities where residents had little knowledge of his past. But the investigation following him was now far larger than it had ever been before. Police departments across North America were exchanging information about his possible whereabouts. Detectives compared travel timelines and examined railway connections between cities where incidents had occurred. This coordinated effort slowly began narrowing the search. At the same time, Nelson himself was becoming increasingly active. His movements grew more frequent, suggesting a restless urgency that investigators later interpreted as a sign that he may have been aware of the growing attention surrounding the case. Whether he realized the scale of the manhunt or not remains uncertain. But what is clear is that his ability to remain invisible was beginning to weaken. Each new incident brought additional witnesses. Each investigation produced new details, and gradually, the gap between Nelson and the authorities pursuing him was shrinking. In one Canadian city, a particularly important breakthrough occurred when witnesses provided descriptions of a suspicious traveler who had recently visited a boarding house. The details matched the descriptions already circulating among investigators. Police began tracing the man's movements through the city. They discovered that he had been seen carrying luggage and speaking politely with residents in the neighborhood. But once again, he had disappeared shortly afterward. Still, this time something was different. The information arrived quickly enough that authorities in nearby regions could begin searching for him before he traveled too far. Officers were alerted, descriptions were shared with surrounding communities, and for the first time during the investigation, it seemed possible that the mysterious traveler might actually be located. For years, Nelson had relied on anonymity and mobility to avoid capture. Now those advantages were beginning to disappear. The international manhunt was closing in. Communities across both the United States and Canada had heard his description. Police departments were cooperating more actively than ever before. And somewhere along the railway routes he had traveled so often, investigators were moving closer to the moment when his long journey would finally come to an end. The quiet stranger who had once moved unnoticed between boarding houses and train stations was no longer invisible. Authorities now knew his name, they knew his methods, and they were determined to stop him before he could disappear again. The final stage of the investigation was approaching, and soon, the man who had eluded police across two nations would face the moment when his travels ended. Chapter 10: The Arrest That Shocked Two Nations. By the summer of 1927, the long search for Earle Leonard Nelson had reached a turning point. For months, investigators across the United States and Canada had been attempting to trace the movements of the quiet traveler whose name had become associated with a growing number of disturbing incidents. What began as scattered investigations in distant cities had now evolved into a coordinated effort involving multiple police departments and international communication between authorities. The man once described only as a mysterious stranger now had a name. His description was circulating widely, and communities across North America were watching carefully for any traveler who might resemble him. Despite this growing awareness, Nelson continued moving. He traveled through Canada using the same railway routes that had allowed him to move freely for years. The system that once protected him, busy stations, anonymous crowds, and boarding houses welcoming travelers, was still functioning as it always had. But something had changed. The investigation following him had grown larger than ever before. Police departments were exchanging information more quickly. Reports from one region were now reaching others in time to influence their investigations. Descriptions of Nelson's appearance and behavior were becoming more precise, and slowly, the distance between the suspect and the authorities searching for him was shrinking to in June of 1927. Nelson arrived in the Canadian city of Winnipeg, Manitoba. Winnipeg was a busy transportation hub during this period, connecting railway lines that carried passengers and goods across Western Canada. Travelers from many different regions passed through the city every day. For Nelson, it was simply another stop along his journey that he entered the city quietly, appearing no different from the hundreds of travelers who arrived daily. But events in Winnipeg would soon bring his long period of freedom to an end. Among the residents of the city was a woman named Emily Patterson. Like many women during that era, she managed a boarding house where travelers could rent rooms for short stays. Her home operated under the same system of trust that had existed in countless boarding houses across North America. That a traveler arrived, that a brief conversation took place, and if the guest appeared respectable, a room was offered. When Nelson approached her home, he likely appeared exactly as he had in many other cities: quiet, polite, carrying a suitcase. Nothing about his demeanor would have suggested that he was the subject of an international investigation. Yet events inside the house soon raised concern at some point after Nelson's visit. Suspicious circumstances surrounding Patterson's disappearance led neighbors and acquaintances to contact authorities. Police officers arriving at the property quickly realized that something unusual had occurred. The situation bore disturbing similarities to cases investigators had already been discussing across the continent. That a traveler had visited the home, and now the homeowner could not be located. Detectives began examining the scene carefully. Witnesses in the neighborhood provided descriptions of a man who had been seen entering or leaving the house. Those descriptions immediately caught the attention of investigators. They closely matched the appearance of the suspect already being sought in connection with earlier incidents. For the first time during the investigation, Authorities believed they might be close enough to intercept him. Officers began tracing the movements of the man witnesses had described. They checked nearby streets. They spoke with residents who might have seen where he went after leaving the house. Gradually, a possible direction emerged. Someone matching the description had reportedly been seen walking through the area carrying luggage. The trail did not end there as officers followed these reports. They discovered something even more promising. The suspect had reportedly been seen interacting with another resident of the neighborhood shortly after leaving the house. This encounter would become one of the most important moments in the entire investigation, because the individual who met Nelson that day would play a crucial role in identifying him and alerting authorities. For years, Nelson had relied on anonymity to escape capture. He moved quickly, he left little evidence behind, and witnesses rarely had enough information to identify him later. But in Winnipeg, the circumstances were about to change. The man who had traveled across two nations avoiding detection was now in a city where people were beginning to recognize the descriptions circulating in newspapers and police bulletins, and one observant resident was about to notice something that would alter the course of the investigation. For the first time since the manhunt began, the possibility of capturing Nelson was no longer distant. That it was suddenly within reach. The quiet traveler who had eluded authorities for so long had unknowingly arrived in the city where his long journey would finally end, and the events that followed would become one of the most dramatic arrests in the history of the case. In the hours following the discovery that something had gone terribly wrong at the Winnipeg boarding house run by Emily Patterson, investigators moved quickly. The similarities between this incident and the cases authorities had been discussing across North America were impossible to ignore. Once again, witnesses described a quiet traveler. Once again, the visitor had arrived carrying luggage, and once again, he had disappeared shortly afterward. For detectives already familiar with the ongoing investigation into Earle Leonard Nelson, the possibility that Nelson had passed through Winnipeg suddenly became very real. Officers began canvassing the neighborhood carefully. They spoke with residents who might have noticed strangers in the area. They asked shopkeepers and pedestrians whether they had seen anyone matching the description circulated through police bulletins. And slowly, fragments of information began to come together. Several witnesses remembered seeing a man walking away from the boarding house carrying a suitcase. He had not appeared to be in a hurry. In fact, he seemed calm, almost casual, as he moved through the streets. But one particular observation proved especially important: that a local resident recalled encountering the traveler after he left the boarding house. During their brief interaction, the stranger's behavior struck the resident as unusual enough to remain memorable. The traveler appeared polite, but there was something about his demeanor that seemed unsettling. His eyes, the witness later recalled, seemed unusually intense, and his posture appeared slightly hunched. These details matched the descriptions investigators had already been circulating. Realizing the importance of the sighting, officers began tracing the route the suspect had taken after leaving the house. Reports suggested that he had moved toward another residential area not far away. Detectives quickly organized a search. Police officers spread through the neighborhood, speaking with residents and looking for anyone who might match the suspect's description. This time, the search did not take long. Within a short period, officers located a man staying nearby who fit the description almost perfectly. That he appeared quiet and calm, carrying luggage just as witnesses had described. When questioned by authorities, the man identified himself as a traveler passing through the city, but the investigators who had been following the case closely immediately recognized the significance of the situation. The man standing before them strongly resembled the individual whose description had circulated through police departments across two countries. They asked additional questions, they examined his belongings. And gradually, the evidence began pointing toward a conclusion that investigators across North America had been hoping for. The traveler was indeed Earle Leonard Nelson. For years, he had moved between cities avoiding detection. Now, in Winnipeg, that journey had finally come to an end. The arrest itself was surprisingly calm. Nelson did not attempt to flee or resist when officers took him into custody. Those present during the arrest later described him as quiet and composed, displaying little visible emotion as he was escorted away. This calm behavior puzzled many observers. The man authorities believed responsible for multiple crimes across two nations appeared almost indifferent to the gravity of the situation. But for investigators, the importance of the moment was undeniable. After months of searching and speculation, they had finally located the suspect whose movements had perplexed detectives across North America. News of the arrest spread quickly. Newspapers across the United States and Canada began reporting that the mysterious traveler believed to be responsible for a series of crimes had finally been captured. The story captured public attention immediately. Readers who had followed the investigation through scattered reports suddenly saw the pieces of the puzzle coming together. The quiet stranger described in earlier articles now had a name, a face, and a history that investigators were only beginning to examine in detail. Authorities in multiple jurisdictions began contacting the Winnipeg Police Department, seeking confirmation that the man in custody was indeed the suspect connected to their cases. Records were compared, witness descriptions were reviewed, and gradually, the scope of Nelson's activities began to emerge. For the first time, investigators could examine the evidence with the suspect already in custody, but as detectives began questioning him, they encountered something unexpected. Nelson did not behave like the criminals they were accustomed to interrogating. That he spoke calmly, sometimes even politely. At times he appeared cooperative, answering questions without hesitation. Yet his demeanor remained strangely detached from the seriousness of the situation. This unusual behavior would later become one of the most discussed aspects of the case. Observers struggled to understand how someone accused of such crimes could appear so calm while facing investigators. But regardless of his demeanor, one fact was now clear. The long search had ended. The traveler who had moved between cities for years had finally been captured, and the investigation that followed would reveal details about Nelson's life and actions that shocked communities across two nations. For authorities, the arrest marked the beginning of the next phase of the case: interrogations, evidence, and eventually, a trial that would bring one of the most disturbing criminal stories of the decade into the public spotlight. Chapter 11: Inside the Mind of Earle Leonard Nelson. After the arrest of Earle Leonard Nelson in Winnipeg during the summer of 1927, investigators faced a new and equally complex challenge. Capturing the suspect had ended the long manhunt, but it also opened a deeper mystery, one that detectives, journalists, and psychologists would attempt to understand for years afterward. Who exactly was Earle Leonard Nelson? How had a quiet traveler managed to move through cities across two nations while leaving behind such a disturbing trail? And perhaps most puzzling of all, what kind of mind allowed someone to appear calm and polite while carrying out actions that shocked entire communities? The early hours following his arrest offered investigators their first opportunity to observe Nelson closely. Officers who interacted with him were immediately struck by his demeanor. Unlike many suspects who reacted with fear, anger, or panic when taken into custody, Nelson appeared remarkably composed. He spoke calmly, he answered questions politely, and he displayed little visible anxiety about the situation he now faced. For detectives accustomed to dealing with suspects who attempted to deny responsibility or resist questioning, This behavior seemed unusual. Some officers later described the experience as unsettling. Nelson did not behave like a desperate man trying to escape punishment. Instead, he appeared detached from the emotional weight of the situation. This calm demeanor raised immediate questions about his psychological state. Investigators began examining Nelson's past more closely, searching for clues that might explain his behavior. What they discovered revealed a life marked by instability and unusual experiences long before the crimes that made headlines. Records showed that Nelson had grown up in California under the care of his grandmother, whose strict religious beliefs shaped much of his early childhood. The household environment emphasized moral discipline and constant awareness of sin, creating a framework in which mistakes were often associated with severe spiritual consequences. As a young boy, Nelson had been described as quiet and withdrawn. Teachers remembered him as someone who rarely attracted attention. He did not appear violent. He did not stand out as a troublemaker. Yet, even during those early years, there were signs that his emotional development might have been different from that of other children. Family members later recalled moments when his behavior seemed unusually distant or introspective. These observations alone might not have raised serious concerns. But when investigators learned about the head injury Nelson suffered during his youth, the story took on a new dimension. The accident, which involved a streetcar, reportedly left him unconscious for an extended period of time. Medical knowledge during the early 20th century was limited when it came to understanding brain injuries, and Nelson was eventually allowed to return to normal life once he physically recovered. But those who knew him believed something had changed. His personality appeared different. He became more withdrawn at tea times. He seemed disconnected from the people around him. Modern researchers studying historical criminal cases often point to this injury as a possible contributing factor to Nelson's later behavior. While it is impossible to determine its exact effects, trauma to the brain can sometimes influence emotional regulation, impulse control, and empathy. That if Nelson experienced such changes, they may have interacted with the strict moral environment of his childhood in complicated ways. Another important discovery during the investigation involved Nelson's earlier encounters with mental health institutions at various points in his young adulthood. Concerns about his behavior had led to evaluations by medical authorities. Reports suggested that he experienced episodes of intense religious anxiety and obsessive thoughts about moral wrongdoing. In other words, Nelson appeared to live with a powerful internal conflict. He had been raised to fear moral failure, yet he struggled to control impulses that seemed to contradict those teachings. This psychological tension may have created a cycle in which guilt and repression intensified his emotional instability. But as investigators continued questioning Nelson, they encountered another puzzling aspect of his personality. He often spoke about his actions with a tone that suggested detachment rather than remorse. At tea times, he appeared willing to discuss events openly, yet his emotional reactions remained subdued. This contrast between cooperation and emotional distance made it difficult for investigators to interpret his mindset. Some believed he was deliberately concealing his true feelings. Others suspected that he genuinely lacked the emotional responses expected in such situations. The more authorities examined Nelson's behavior, the clearer it became that understanding his actions would require more than simply examining the physical evidence. They needed to understand the psychology behind them. Journalists covering the case became fascinated by this question. Newspaper articles speculated about whether Nelson's behavior could be explained by mental illness, childhood trauma, or the effects of his head injury. For readers across North America, the idea that a seemingly ordinary traveler might harbor such a complex psychological history was both fascinating and disturbing. The investigation had moved beyond the search for a suspect. Now it was an attempt to understand the mind behind the crimes. And as authorities continued questioning Nelson, they would soon learn even more about the strange combination of influences that had shaped his life. Because the calm man sitting in the interrogation room was not simply a traveler who had been caught after years of movement. He was someone whose past contained layers of psychological conflict, personal instability, and emotional detachment that investigators were only beginning to uncover. And those discoveries would play a crucial role in the legal proceedings that were about to follow. As investigators continued examining the background of Earle Leonard Nelson, they slowly began building a psychological portrait of a man whose life had been shaped by a complex mixture of influences. The calm demeanor Nelson displayed after his arrest puzzled many observers, but for those studying his history more carefully, it appeared to reflect patterns that had existed for many years. One of the most striking characteristics of Nelson's personality was his emotional detachment. During questioning, he often spoke in a steady, measured tone. Officers who participated in the interrogations later recalled that he did not show the level of fear or agitation commonly seen in suspects facing serious charges. Instead, he appeared almost analytical when discussing events at times. He seemed willing to provide information to at other moments. He spoke about his experiences in ways that suggested a strange separation between his actions and his emotions. This behavior led some investigators to believe that Nelson might not fully process the emotional consequences of his actions in the same way most people do. Modern psychologists often emphasize that empathy, the ability to understand and share the feelings of others, plays an important role in regulating human behavior. When empathy is reduced or disrupted, individuals may struggle to recognize the emotional impact of their decisions, whether due to neurological factors, psychological trauma, or a combination of influences. Nelson appeared to exhibit a limited capacity for emotional connection. Another element that investigators found intriguing was the continued presence of religious themes in his thinking. Despite the violent actions he was accused of, Nelson sometimes spoke about morality and spiritual concerns during questioning. The strict religious environment of his childhood had clearly left a lasting impression on his worldview. However, instead of guiding his behavior towards stability, these beliefs appeared to exist alongside the darker impulses that shaped his adult life. This contradiction between moral awareness and destructive behavior became one of the most puzzling aspects of the case. Some observers believed Nelson experienced cycles of intense guilt followed by emotional detachment. Others speculated that his strict upbringing may have contributed to internal conflicts that he never learned to resolve. Investigators also reviewed the years Nelson spent traveling across the continent before his arrest. Those years revealed another important factor in his psychological development: isolation. Nelson had rarely remained in one place long enough to form lasting relationships. His life consisted of temporary jobs, short-term lodging, and constant movement between unfamiliar cities. This lifestyle may have deepened his emotional distance from others. Without strong personal connections, the social bonds that normally reinforce empathy and responsibility can weaken. For Nelson, the absence of those bonds may have allowed troubling thoughts and impulses to grow unchecked. The more investigators studied his history, the clearer it became that Nelson's life had been shaped by multiple influences rather than a single defining event. The head injury of his youth, the strict religious discipline of his childhood, the psychological instability that appeared during adolescence, and the years of wandering that removed him from stable relationships. Together, these elements created a personality that many experts later described as deeply conflicted. Yet, even with these explanations, the The central question remained difficult to answer. How could someone who appeared so ordinary during casual encounters become responsible for such disturbing actions? The answer may lie in the contrast between Nelson's outward behavior and his internal state to strangers. He seemed polite and reserved. He spoke calmly. He dressed neatly. Nothing about his appearance suggested danger, but internally, investigators believed he experienced impulses and emotional patterns that were largely invisible to the people around him. This ability to present a calm exterior allowed him to move unnoticed through communities. Boarding house owners welcomed him because he appeared trustworthy. Neighbors paid little attention because he behaved like any other traveler. The same qualities that helped him avoid suspicion also made the case more unsettling for the public. The idea that someone could hide such a complex and troubled personality behind an ordinary appearance challenged the assumptions many people held about criminal behavior. Newspapers covering the case often emphasized this contrast. Articles described Nelson as a quiet man whose actions seemed difficult to reconcile with his demeanor. Readers across North America followed the story closely, fascinated by the attempt to understand the mind of someone whose life had taken such a dark path. But while psychologists and journalists speculated about Nelson's motivations, the legal system was preparing for the next stage of the case. The focus was shifting from investigation to prosecution. Evidence would be presented, witnesses would testify, and a courtroom would soon become the setting where Nelson's actions and his past would be examined in full view of the public. The quiet traveler who had spent years moving anonymously between cities was about to face a legal process that would determine his fate. And the outcome of that process would mark the final chapter in the story of one of the most unsettling criminal cases of the 1920s. Chapter 12: Trial, Execution, and the Legacy of Earle Leonard Nelson. With the arrest of Earle Leonard Nelson in Winnipeg in 1927, the long and complex investigation that had spanned 2 countries moved into its final phase. The man who had once traveled quietly through railway stations and boarding houses across North America was now at the center of one of the most widely discussed criminal trials of the decade. For months, newspapers across Canada and the United States had reported on the mysterious traveler whose movements seemed connected to a series of disturbing crimes. Now, with Nelson in custody, the public wanted answers. Who was this man? How many crimes had he committed, and what would justice look like for the communities affected by his actions? The legal process began soon after his arrest. Because the most recent incident connected to Nelson had occurred in Winnipeg, Canadian authorities took responsibility for prosecuting the case. This meant that the trial would take place in Canada. Even though investigators from the United States remained deeply involved in examining Nelson's past, law enforcement officials from several American cities provided information about incidents that appeared connected to his travels. These reports helped prosecutors establish the broader context of Nelson's behavior. Though the legal case itself focused primarily on the events that occurred in Winnipeg, as preparations for the trial began, Nelson remained under close supervision in custody. Those who interacted with him during this period continued to observe the same unusual demeanor that had puzzled investigators earlier. He appeared calm and composed, rarely displaying visible signs of anxiety about the proceedings that would determine his future. Jail staff later recalled that he behaved quietly and followed instructions without resistance. This calm behavior stood in sharp contrast to the intense public attention surrounding the case. Newspapers printed detailed articles about the investigation, the arrest, and Nelson's background. Readers followed every new development closely, eager to learn more about the man whose travels had led to such a dramatic international manhunt. Courtroom proceedings began later that year. The trial attracted enormous public interest, with journalists and spectators filling the courtroom to observe the proceedings. For many people, the case represented one of the most unusual criminal investigations they had ever followed. Prosecutors presented evidence describing Nelson's movements in the days leading up to his arrest. Witnesses testified about seeing him in the Winnipeg neighborhood where the boarding house operated. Other witnesses described encounters with him shortly after the events that brought police attention to the case. The prosecution's goal was to demonstrate that Nelson had been present at the scene and that the evidence connected him directly to the crime under investigation. Defense attorneys, meanwhile, focused on Nelson's mental state. They argued that his troubled background, including the head injury he suffered during childhood and his history of psychological instability, should be considered when evaluating his responsibility. This argument reflected a broader debate that often appears in criminal trials involving unusual psychological circumstances. Was Nelson fully aware of the consequences of his actions? Or had his mental condition impaired his ability to understand what he was doing? Medical experts were called to examine these questions. Doctors who evaluated Nelson testified about his psychological condition, describing the patterns of behavior investigators had already observed. Some acknowledged that his past suggested emotional instability, but determining the precise impact of those factors on his actions remained difficult. In the end, the court had to weigh these arguments carefully. The jury listened to testimony from investigators, witnesses, and medical professionals. They reviewed the evidence presented by both sides, and after considering the facts of the case, they reached their conclusion. The verdict was clear. Nelson was found guilty. The decision marked a decisive moment in a case that had captured attention across two nations. For the communities affected by the crimes, the verdict represented the end of a long and unsettling chapter, but the legal process was not yet finished. Following the conviction, the court moved to the next stage of the proceedings, the determination of Nelson's sentence. And that decision would bring the story of the traveling offender who once moved unnoticed between cities to its final conclusion. After the conviction of Earle Leonard Nelson, the courtroom fell into a heavy silence. The jury's decision marked the final legal judgment on a case that had unsettled communities across two nations. For months, people in both the United States and Canada had followed the story closely, trying to understand how a quiet traveler had managed to move through so many cities while leaving behind a trail of tragedy. Now the focus shifted to the final stage of the legal process. The judge addressed the courtroom, summarizing the seriousness of the case and the responsibility the court carried in delivering justice. In the 1920s, criminal sentencing for severe crimes was often decisive and swift, reflecting the legal standards of the time. After reviewing the verdict and the evidence presented during the trial, the court issued its sentence. Nelson was condemned to death. The announcement spread quickly beyond the courtroom walls. Within hours, newspapers began reporting the verdict, and headlines across North America informed readers that the mysterious traveler whose actions had perplexed investigators for so long had now been sentenced. For many members of the public, the decision brought a sense of closure. The man whose movements had once been difficult to trace was no longer an unknown figure moving between cities. His identity, his past, and the legal judgment against him had all been revealed. Yet even as the sentence was announced, discussion about Nelson's psychological state continued. Some observers argued that his troubled childhood, head injury, and emotional instability should have played a larger role in determining his fate. Others believed that the severity of the crimes left little room for alternative outcomes. These debates reflected broader questions about the nature of criminal behavior, questions that continue to appear in discussions about justice even today. In the months following the trial, Nelson remained in custody, as the legal process moved toward its final stage. During this time, prison officials and observers noted that his demeanor remained largely unchanged. He continued to behave quietly and calmly, following routines within the prison environment without creating disturbances. Those who interacted with him often remarked on the same characteristic investigators had noticed since his arrest: his emotional detachment. He rarely displayed strong reactions when discussing the case or his future. Instead, he appeared reserved and introspective. Eventually, the date for his execution was scheduled that on January 13th, 1928, the sentence was carried out at the Vaughan Street Jail, the same facility where Nelson had been held following his conviction. The event marked the end of one of the most unusual criminal investigations of the decade. The quiet traveler who had once moved through cities across North America was now a figure of history in the years that followed. Historians and criminologists continued studying Nelson's life in an attempt to understand the factors that shaped his behavior. Some focused on the head injury he suffered during childhood, considering whether neurological trauma may have influenced his emotional development. Others examined the strict religious environment in which he had been raised, exploring how intense moral pressure might interact with psychological instability. Still others pointed to the years of isolation and constant travel that defined his adult life. Without lasting relationships or community connections, Nelson existed largely outside the social networks that often guide behavior and provide emotional support. These various influences created a complicated portrait of a man whose life followed an increasingly troubled path. Yet despite these attempts to explain his actions, the case continues to raise difficult questions. Human behavior rarely has a single cause. Instead, it is shaped by countless experiences, choices, and circumstances over time. Nelson's story illustrates how a combination of personal history, psychological challenges, and opportunity can lead individuals down paths that seem almost impossible to understand. For law enforcement agencies, the investigation into Nelson's crimes also produced important lessons. The difficulty of tracking a suspect moving between jurisdictions highlighted the need for improved communication between police departments. Over time, systems for sharing information and coordinating investigations across regions became far more advanced. Today, modern law enforcement agencies rely on centralized databases, rapid communication networks, and coordinated investigative teams in many ways. Cases like Nelson's helped reveal the weaknesses of earlier systems and contributed to the development of these improvements. For historians, the story of Earle Leonard Nelson remains one of the earliest examples of a traveling serial offender whose actions crossed international borders. His ability to move unnoticed between communities demonstrated how mobility and anonymity could complicate criminal investigations in the early 20th century. Yet the case also reminds us that even the most elusive individuals can eventually be identified when investigators share information and work together. The quiet traveler who once appeared ordinary enough to pass unnoticed in any city ultimately became the subject of one of the most extensive investigations of his time, and his story continues to be remembered as a chilling chapter in the history of crime, one that began with a knock on a boarding house door and ended with an international manhunt that captured the attention of an entire continent.